Hello everyone! Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Walls That Breathe, from Marcus. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the amber glow of my headlights, and I should have known better than to take that exit. 23 years hauling freight across the American heartland, and you develop instincts about these things. The GPS had been acting strange for the past hour, recalculating routes that didn't exist, suggesting turns onto roads that weren't there. When it finally died completely somewhere outside Bakersfield, I was running on fumes and fighting to keep my eyes open. The truck stop appeared like a mirage in the desert darkness, its neon sign flickering Desert Rose Motors in letters that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time itself, all cracked asphalt and weathered concrete. But the diesel pumps were modern enough and my fuel gauge was kissing empty. I pulled my rig alongside the building, the air brakes hissing their relief as I brought 18 wheels to a stop. The night air hit me like a warm blanket when I stepped down from the cab, carrying the scent of sage and something else I couldn't quite place, something organic and slightly sweet, the kind of smell you might find in an old root cellar or a basement that hasn't been opened in years. I chalked it up to desert vegetation and made my way toward the main building, gravel crunching under my boots in a rhythm that seemed oddly hypnotic. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song, casting everything in that particular shade of white that makes everyone look slightly sick. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. When I asked about overnight parking, he nodded toward a section of lot behind the building where several other trucks sat in various states of rest. Some had their running lights on, others were dark and silent as sleeping giants. $20 for the spot, he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that made me think of dried leaves. There's a shower trailer out back if you need it. Clean towels are 50 cents extra. I handed over the cash and grabbed a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, but the caffeine was what mattered. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed the shower trailer he'd mentioned, sitting at the far edge of the lot like an afterthought. It was one of those portable units you see at construction sites. White aluminum siding with a small set of metal steps leading up to a door that had seen better decades. The coffee did its job for a while, but by 2 a.m, the long day behind the wheel was catching up to me. I'd been pushing hard to make a delivery deadline in Phoenix, and my body was demanding rest whether I liked it or not. The sleeper berth in my cab was comfortable enough, but 23 years of truck stop parking lots had taught me that a real shower could make the difference between decent rest and just lying there listening to your own discomfort. The desert night had turned surprisingly cool, and a breeze had picked up that made the trailer rock slightly on its foundation blocks. As I approached the shower unit, I noticed that despite its weathered exterior, the structure seemed solid enough. The door opened with a metallic groan that echoed across the empty lot, and I stepped inside to find exactly what I'd expected. A small changing area with a bench and hooks for clothes, and beyond that, a shower stall with a curtain that had once been white, but was now more of a beige color that comes with age and use. The water pressure was better than I'd anticipated, hot and steady, and for a few minutes I let myself relax under the stream, feeling the tension of the road wash away down the drain. It was then that I first noticed something odd about the walls. The panels that made up the interior of the trailer seemed to have a slight give to them when I leaned against one to steady myself while washing my feet. Not unusual in itself, these portable units weren't built to last forever, but there was something about the way the wall flexed that felt wrong, almost organic. I pressed my palm against the panel more deliberately, and the material yielded like skin over muscle, returning to its original shape when I pulled my hand away. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cooling water, and I quickly finished rinsing off, suddenly eager to get out of the confined space. But when I reached for the shower controls to turn off the water, the walls around me seemed to pulse once, gently, like the chamber of a heart. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Old plumbing could cause pressure changes that might make flexible wall panels move. The desert wind outside could create pressure differentials. But as I stood there with the water still running, I felt it again. A subtle expansion and contraction of the walls around me, accompanied by what I could have sworn was the faintest sound of breathing. I shut off the water with more force than necessary. The sudden silence filled only by the drip of residual droplets and the distant hum of the truck stop's generators. But underneath those familiar sounds, I could hear something else so quiet I had to hold my breath to detect it. A rhythmic sound, soft and steady, like someone sleeping deeply in the next room. The walls were definitely moving now, not dramatically, but with the gentle rise and fall of respiration. My clothes were in the changing area, just a few feet away through the shower curtain, but those few feet might as well have been miles. The trailer felt smaller than when I'd entered, the walls seeming to lean inward slightly, and the ceiling appeared lower than I remembered. I pushed through the curtain with my towel wrapped around my waist, telling myself that panic was the enemy of rational thought. But my hands were shaking as I reached for my jeans. The breathing sound was clearer now, definitely coming from within the walls themselves. And as I pulled on my clothes with clumsy haste, I noticed that the interior panels had a slight translucency to them that I hadn't seen before. Not enough to see through them, but sufficient to reveal darker areas underneath, patches of shadow that moved and shifted like clouds passing across the moon. The walls continued their gentle breathing, and with each exhalation, the trailer seemed to grow smaller. I was fumbling with my boots when the quality of the breathing changed, becoming deeper, more deliberate, as though something large was stirring from sleep. The walls began to move more noticeably, contracting inward by inches rather than fractions of inches, and the patches of shadow beneath the surface became more defined, resolving into shapes that looked disturbingly familiar. They were handprints, dozens of them, pressed against the interior of the walls from the other side, as though people were trapped within the structure itself. The door handle turned easily under my grip, but the door itself wouldn't budge. I put my shoulder against it and pushed, but it held fast, and I realized with growing horror that the doorframe had warped, the opening compressed by the contracting walls until the door no longer fit. The breathing around me grew louder, more ragged, and the handprints beneath the surface of the walls began to move, fingers spreading and contracting, palms sliding across the interior surface like people trying to find their way out of a maze. Panic finally broke through my attempts at rational thought, and I threw myself against the door with everything I had. The frame groaned and flexed but held, and the walls continued their relentless inward motion. The trailer was definitely smaller now, the ceiling close enough that I had to duck slightly, and the breathing had become a wheeze, as though whatever vast lung the structure served was struggling with the effort of its own respiration. The handprints were clearer now, defined enough that I could see individual fingers, and some of them bore the impression of rings or watches. These weren't abstract shapes or tricks of light and shadow. These were the marks of real people, pressed against barriers they couldn't break through. And as the walls contracted further, I began to hear voices, faint and muffled, calling out words I couldn't quite understand. I attacked the door with renewed desperation, kicking at the frame where it met the wall, and felt something give. The metal groaned and bent, and a gap appeared at the top of the door frame, narrow but potentially wide enough for me to squeeze through. The walls were close enough now that I could touch both sides of the trailer simultaneously, and the handprints were so clear I could see the lines on the palms, the whirls of fingerprints, the desperate gestures of people trying to claw their way to freedom. The voices were louder too, a chorus of whispers and pleas, and I was certain I heard someone call my name, though that might have been the fear talking. With strength born of pure terror, I managed to wrench the door far enough from its frame to create an opening I could barely fit through. The metal edges scraped against my back as I forced myself through the gap, and I tumbled down the trailer steps to land hard on the gravel parking lot. The wrong load. From Marcus Webb. The thing about pulling doubles is that you get real familiar with what's behind you. 23 years driving 18-wheelers across the heartland, and I've hauled everything from refrigerated produce to construction equipment. But doubles, those twin trailers hitched together like railroad cars, they require a different kind of attention. You learn the rhythm of how they track through turns, the way they sway in crosswinds, and most importantly, you know exactly what you're pulling just by checking that rear view mirror. That's why what happened on Interstate 40 between Little Rock and Memphis still keeps me up some nights, even though it was 8 months ago come Tuesday. I was hauling a pair of dry vans loaded with automotive parts bound for a Ford plant outside Nashville. Standard run, nothing special about the cargo or the route. The weather was cooperating too. Clear November night, temperature holding steady in the low 50s. Hardly any traffic to speak of once you got past the Little Rock suburbs. I'd picked up the load that morning from a distribution center in Oklahoma City, done my pre-trip inspection like always, checked the connections between the tractors, verified the placards, all of it. Both trailers were identical white dry vans, 53-footers with the standard ICC bumpers and red reflective tape. Nothing remarkable about them except for the small blue company logos near the rear doors, twin rectangular decals that caught the light just so when my trailer lamps hit them, the first sign something wasn't right came about 2 hours into Arkansas. I was maintaining a steady 65 in the right lane, listening to an overnight talk radio show about UFO sightings, when I adjusted my rear view mirror to check on traffic. That's when I noticed the second trailer looked different somehow. Not dramatically different, mind you. Just enough to make me do that double take you do when something's not quite matching your expectations. The reflective tape seemed brighter, more orange than red, and I couldn't make out those blue company logos I'd been seeing all evening. Could have been the angle of the mirror, or maybe some other truck's lights playing tricks on my vision, but it nagged at me the way a loose tooth nags at your tongue. I adjusted the mirror again, trying to get a clearer view. But a semi-hauling cattle passed me on the left just then, and by the time he cleared my field of vision, everything looked normal again. I chalked it up to road fatigue and kept driving, but that uneasy feeling settled in my stomach like bad truck stop coffee. You develop instincts in this job. Learn to trust that little voice that tells you when something's off, even if you can't pin down exactly what it is. The engine was purring smooth, the air pressure was holding steady, transmission temperature normal, all the mechanical stuff checked out fine. But that feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my concentration. Around midnight, I pulled into a truck stop outside Forest City to fuel up and grab a sandwich. The place was mostly empty except for a couple other drivers catching some sleep in their cabs, and a lone four-wheeler at the gas pumps. I topped off my tanks and did a quick walk around, checking tires and lights, paying special attention to both trailers. Everything looked exactly like it should. Same white paint job, same red reflective tape, same blue company logos positioned right where they belonged. But as I was climbing back into the cab, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision that made me pause with one foot on the step. For just a split second, it seemed like the rear trailer was a different color entirely. Darker, maybe black or deep gray, and shaped wrong somehow, like it was shorter or taller than it should be. I turned to look directly at it, and of course it was just the regular white dry van it had always been. Nothing unusual about it at all. I settled back behind the wheel and pulled out onto the interstate, telling myself I needed to get more sleep during my off-duty hours, that my eyes were playing tricks on me from too many nights running hard to make delivery appointments. The radio was picking up some oldies station out of Memphis, playing slow country songs that seemed to match the hypnotic rhythm of tire treads on asphalt. That's when I started noticing the trailer wasn't tracking quite right through the curves. Doubles have their own physics. They don't follow the same path as a single trailer, and you have to account for that when you're navigating turns or changing lanes. But now it felt like the rear trailer was pulling slightly to one side, creating a drag I hadn't felt before. Nothing dramatic enough to be dangerous, just a subtle resistance that hadn't been there during the first half of the trip. I checked my mirrors more frequently after that, trying to diagnose what might be causing the handling change. Could have been a tire going soft, or maybe one of the electrical connections was acting up and affecting the trailer brakes. But every time I looked back, both trailers appeared normal, two identical, white boxes following obediently behind me through the Arkansas darkness. It was somewhere between Forest, City, and West Memphis that I started noticing the lights were wrong. Not my trailer lights, but the ones reflecting in my mirrors from whatever was behind me. The red marker lights that outline the rear of a trailer seemed positioned differently, and there appeared to be more of them than there should be. Instead of the standard configuration I knew by heart, there were additional lights arranged in patterns that didn't match any dot regulations I'd ever seen. I slowed down and moved to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking, intending to stop and investigate whatever was happening back there. But as I was downshifting and preparing to brake, I caught sight of something in the rear view that made my blood turn cold. The rear trailer wasn't a trailer at all anymore. It was some kind of elongated passenger car, dark and sleek, with rows of windows that glowed with a pale yellow light. And silhouetted against those windows were shapes that might have been people, dozens of them, sitting perfectly still and facing forward. I blinked hard and looked again, and it was just my regular dry van trailer, same as always. But my hands were shaking on the steering wheel now, and that gnawing uneasiness had transformed into something approaching panic. I pulled back into traffic and increased my speed, wanting to reach Memphis and the delivery point as quickly as possible, wanting to get these trailers, whatever they really were, disconnected from my tractor and out of my responsibility. The final hour of that run was the longest of my driving career. Every few minutes I'd check the mirrors and see something different back there. Sometimes it looked like a massive livestock trailer, with gaps between the slats through which I could glimpse movement. Sometimes like a flatbed loaded with machinery that seemed to shift and reconfigure itself as I watched. Once, for about 30 seconds outside West Memphis, it appeared to be an old-fashioned railroad car, complete with a small caboose platform and a dim lantern swinging from a hook. But whenever I tried to focus directly on what I was seeing, it would snap back to being an ordinary white dry van with red reflective tape and blue company logos, like my peripheral vision was picking up something my direct sight couldn't process, or like whatever was behind me only revealed its true nature when I wasn't looking at it straight on. I made the delivery dock in Memphis just as the sun was coming up, backed both trailers into the assigned bays and disconnected them with hands that were still trembling slightly. The receiving clerk was a friendly older gentleman who'd been working that dock for 15 years, and he didn't seem to notice anything unusual about the trailers. He signed off on the delivery paperwork and made small talk about the weather, while the dock workers began unloading the automotive parts. I should have felt relieved once those trailers were no longer my problem. But as I was completing my logbook entries and preparing to deadhead to my next pickup, the dock supervisor approached my cab with a puzzled expression. He was holding a clipboard and scratching his head in that universal gesture of mild confusion. "Driver," he said, "we've got a small discrepancy here. According to your bills of lading, you delivered 2 trailers of Ford parts, but the second trailer doesn't match what we were expecting. The contents are, well, they're not automotive parts at all. Looks like furniture, antique stuff, real old. Could be you picked up the wrong trailer back in Oklahoma City." I climbed down to look for myself, and sure enough, the rear trailer was packed with antique furniture, ornate wooden chairs and tables that looked like they belonged in a museum, all of it covered with a fine layer of dust like it had been sitting in storage for decades. The pieces were arranged as if someone had been trying to recreate the layout of rooms, complete living spaces from some bygone era. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that several of the chairs looked like they'd been recently occupied. The cushions were compressed, and there were faint impressions in the dust on the armrests, as if invisible hands had been gripping them. One rocking chair near the front of the trailer was still moving slightly, creating a barely perceptible creaking sound that seemed to echo in the enclosed space. The Frequency of Forgotten Things, from Marcus Reed. The CB radio had been silent for 3 hours when it first crackled to life somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow. I'd been hauling refrigerated produce down Interstate 5, the familiar hum of my Peterbilt's engine, and the steady thrum of the cooling unit creating that hypnotic rhythm that makes the miles disappear. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m., and the desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, dark and unforgiving under a moonless sky. I'd owned this rig for 12 years, knew every sound she made, every vibration that traveled up through the steering wheel. The CB was old, a Cobra 29 that had come with the truck when I bought her used. Most drivers these days relied on cell phones and GPS, but there was something comforting about the old radio. The possibility of connecting with another soul, traversing these lonely highways in the deep hours of the night. The static that emerged from the speaker was different somehow. Not the usual white noise you'd expect from an empty channel. It had texture to it, layers that seemed to shift and pulse like breathing. I reached over and adjusted the squelch, thinking maybe I could clear it up, but the sound only grew more distinct, more purposeful. Channel 19, this is Desert Rose, looking for someone who's listening. The voice was female, warm but distant, like hearing someone speak from the bottom of a well. I glanced at the channel indicator. It showed Channel 9, not 19. Strange, but electronics could be finicky, especially in weather like this with the heavy clouds building on the horizon. I picked up the handset, thumb hovering over the talk button. Something made me hesitate, though I couldn't say what. The voice had quality to it that seemed familiar, though I was certain I'd never heard it before. "This is Nighthawk, eastbound on the 5, I finally responded. "You got your ears on, Desert Rose?" The silence stretched so long I thought maybe the signal had faded, but then she came back clearer now, as if she'd moved closer to her microphone. "Oh, Nighthawk, I've been waiting for you to answer. Been waiting a long time." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Truckers used handles, sure, but how could she have been waiting for me specifically? I'd chosen Nighthawk randomly years ago, and plenty of drivers probably used the same call sign. "Well, you got me now," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "What's your 20? "Same highway as you, Marcus. Same lonely stretch of road." My blood went cold. I'd never given her my real name, and the CB radio wasn't connected to any system that would broadcast that information. I eased off the accelerator slightly, checking my mirrors, but saw only darkness behind me and the faint glow of headlights miles back. "How do you know my name?" I asked, not bothering with CB protocol anymore. Her laugh was soft, almost musical. "Oh, Marcus, there's so much I know about you. So much you've forgotten or tried to forget. That's why I'm here. That's why the Frequency found you tonight." The dashboard lights seemed to dim as she spoke, and I noticed the fuel gauge needle fluctuating, even though the tank had been full when I'd left the truck stop in Bakersfield. The familiar landmark signs along the interstate looked different too, their reflective surfaces seeming to bend and warp in my headlight beams. "I don't understand what you're talking about," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt the first stirring of recognition, like trying to remember a dream that keeps slipping away. "December 15th, 2018, she said, her voice now carrying a weight that made the cab feel smaller. "Rain on Highway 101 just north of San Luis Obispo. You remember the rain, don't you, Marcus? How it drummed on the roof of your cab, how the wipers could barely keep up." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I did remember that night, or pieces of it. I'd been running behind schedule, pushing harder than I should have, tired from too many consecutive runs without proper rest. The rain had started around midnight, turning the highway into a river of reflected light. "You were texting?" Desert Rose continued, her voice now seeming to come from inside the cab with me rather than through the CB speaker. "Just a quick message to Janet, telling her you'd be late getting home." Just to glance down at your phone just for a second. Stop, I whispered, but she continued as if she hadn't heard. The blue Honda Civic was in the right lane, hazard lights blinking. Sarah Chen, 23 years old, nursing student at Cal Poly. Her car had broken down and she was trying to reach the next exit. She was someone's daughter, Marcus. Someone's whole world. The memories came flooding back then, sharp and terrible. The moment I'd looked up from my phone to see the disabled vehicle too close, too late. The feeling of the truck's brakes locking up. The trailer starting to jackknife on the wet pavement. The sound of impact, brief and final, cutting through the rain and engine noise. I stopped, I said, my voice rough. I called 911. I waited for the police. They said it wasn't my fault, that she shouldn't have been stopped there, that the rain and darkness made it unavoidable. But you know better, don't you, Marcus? You know those few seconds you spent looking at your phone were the difference between stopping in time and not stopping at all. You know that if you'd been paying attention, really paying attention, you would have seen her hazard lights sooner. The desert around me had changed without my noticing. The familiar landscape of scrub brush and distant mountains had been replaced by something else, somewhere that looked oddly like Highway 101 in the rain. The asphalt gleamed wet in my headlight beams, and I could hear the sound of rain on the roof even though the sky had been clear moments before. This isn't real, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. What's real, Marcus? The story you tell yourself? The report that cleared you of legal responsibility? Or the truth that follows you down every highway every night, in every long, empty hour when there's nothing to distract you from what really happened? I wanted to turn off the CB radio to cut the connection, but my hand wouldn't move toward the power switch. The voice that called itself Desert Rose had become multiple voices now, layering over each other like a chorus of accusation. You never visited her grave, one voice said. Never sent a card to her parents, said another. Never even learned her middle name, whispered a third. I couldn't, I said, tears blurring my vision. I couldn't face them. What would I say? You could have said you were sorry, came the unified response. You could have acknowledged that she was more than just an obstacle on the highway, more than just an accident report number. You could have done something besides run from it. The rain was falling harder now, though I still couldn't understand how that was possible. My windshield wipers struggled to keep up, their rhythm matching the beating of my heart. In the distance, I could see hazard lights blinking, four-way flashers cutting through the darkness like a beacon of guilt. No, I said, pressing harder on the accelerator. I'm not doing this again. I'm not reliving this. But the truck seemed to slow despite my efforts, and the hazard lights grew closer. I could see the blue Honda Civic now, disabled in the right lane exactly as it had been that night 5 years ago. The CB radio crackled with static that sounded almost like rain. You have a choice, Marcus, Desert Rose said, her voice now gentle, almost kind. You've always had a choice. You can keep running from what happened, keep pretending that time and distance can erase the weight of regret. Or you can finally stop. You can finally face what you've been carrying all these years. I could see her now in the Honda's back window, a young woman with dark hair, her hand pressed against the glass. She wasn't looking at me with anger or accusation, but with something that might have been understanding. The truck was close enough now that I could stop. Close enough that I could make a different choice than the one I'd made that rainy night in 2018. My foot moved to the brake pedal, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt the truck responding the way it should have, slowing smoothly, coming to a controlled stop with plenty of distance to spare. I sat there in the cab, engine idling, rain drumming on the roof, staring at the hazard lights that had haunted my dreams for so long. The last stop diner for Marcus. The CB crackled with static as I adjusted the dial, searching for any voice in the emptiness of Route 47. My Peterbilt hummed steadily beneath me, its diesel engine providing the only companionship I'd had for the past 6 hours of driving through Nevada's desolate stretches. The fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and my stomach had been growling for the better part of an hour. When the neon sign appeared through the heat shimmer ahead, spelling out "Last Stop Diner" in flickering pink letters, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through like skeletal fingers, but there was enough space for my rig. I pulled in next to a rust-eaten Chevrolet that looked like it hadn't moved in decades, its tires flat and windows clouded with desert dust. The diner itself was a classic silver trailer design, the kind you'd expect to find on vintage postcards, though the chrome had long since dulled to a matte gray. Above the entrance, a smaller neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting an intermittent blue glow that spelled "open" in cursive script. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, and immediately I noticed how refreshingly cool it was compared to the scorching heat outside. The interior was exactly what I'd expected from the exterior, all red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor tiles that had seen better decades. A long counter stretched along one wall, complete with chrome stools that spun when you sat on them. The whole place had that timeless quality that made it impossible to tell whether it was authentically vintage or carefully designed to look that way. Behind the counter stood a woman who appeared to be in her 50s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple white uniform dress with a small name tag that read "Helen" in faded black letters. Her smile was warm and genuine as she looked up from wiping down the already spotless counter surface with a checkered cloth. "Welcome to the last stop," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested years of cigarettes, though I couldn't detect any smell of smoke in the air. "Hot enough for you out there?" I settled onto one of the counter stools, grateful to rest my legs after the long haul. "You can say that again." I was starting to think I'd never find a place to eat out here. "Menu?" Helen's smile widened and she reached beneath the counter. Instead of producing a laminated menu like I'd expected, she placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. The header read "Today's Special" in elegant script, but beneath it, where I expected to see burgers, fries, and coffee, there was only one item listed: ice $5. I stared at the paper for a moment, then looked back up at Helen. "Is this it? Just ice?" "That's all we serve here," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact as if serving only ice was the most natural thing in the world. "But it's very good ice. The best you'll ever taste, I guarantee it." The strangeness of the situation began to settle over me like a heavy blanket. I glanced around the diner again, noting details I'd missed in my initial relief at finding shelter. The grill behind Helen was spotless and cold, without even the faintest trace of grease or cooking odors. The coffee pot sat empty on its burner, and there were no refrigerators or food storage areas visible anywhere. The entire establishment seemed designed around the singular purpose of serving frozen water. "I don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice casual despite the growing uneasiness in my chest. "How do you stay in business selling only ice? People come here for meals, for coffee, for ice." Helen interrupted gently. "That's what they need, even if they don't realize it at first. The desert is hot, Marcus. People get thirsty. They get overheated. Ice is exactly what they need." The fact that she knew my name sent a chill down my spine despite the diner's pleasant temperature. I hadn't introduced myself, and my truck didn't have my name emblazoned on it anywhere. I started to ask how she knew, but Helen had already turned away and was moving toward a door marked "Kitchen" that I hadn't noticed before. "I'll get you a nice bowl," she called over her shoulder. "You'll see what I mean about the quality." While she was gone, I took the opportunity to really examine my surroundings. The diner was completely silent except for the soft hum of what I assumed was air conditioning, though I couldn't see any vents or units. The windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't see my truck outside, which struck me as odd since it had been clearly visible when I'd walked in. Most unsettling of all, despite the open sign and the obviously operational establishment, I appeared to be the only customer. The guest book near the register caught my attention. and I walked over to flip through it while Helen was in the kitchen. The pages were filled with signatures and brief comments, all praising the ice in terms that seemed almost reverential.
Life-changing ice and we'll never forget.
I read one entry. Finally found what I was looking for, said another. Thank you for the relief, wrote a third. The dates on the entries spanned decades, but the ink all looked fresh, as if it had been written yesterday. Helen returned carrying a large crystal bowl filled with ice cubes that seemed to glow with their own internal light. As she set it down in front of my stool, I could see my breath in small puffs, though moments before the temperature had been comfortably cool. The ice itself was unlike anything I'd ever seen, perfectly clear and somehow more substantial than regular frozen water. Each cube was geometrically perfect, as if carved rather than frozen. Go ahead, Helen encouraged, sliding a spoon across the counter toward me. Don't be shy. I picked up one of the cubes with my fingers instead, surprised by how solid it felt, how it didn't immediately begin melting from my body heat. As I brought it closer to my face, I could smell something faint but distinctly pleasant, like mountain air after a storm. When I finally placed it in my mouth, the sensation was extraordinary. The ice didn't just cool my mouth. It seemed to absorb heat from every part of my body simultaneously. The relief was so intense it was almost overwhelming, like stepping into blessed shade after being lost in the desert sun. But as the cube dissolved on my tongue, I began to taste something beneath the cold purity, something that made my stomach clench with sudden dread. It tasted like sadness, not metaphorically but literally, as if grief and despair had been frozen solid and served in a crystal bowl. The flavor was so potent and specific that tears began streaming down my face without warning. I could taste the loneliness of every mile I'd driven alone, every night spent in truck stop parking lots, every phone call home that lasted 30 seconds because there wasn't much to say anymore. What is this? I gasped, pushing the bowl away from me. The ice was melting now, pooling water that looked darker than it should have, almost gray in the diner's fluorescent lighting. Helen's warm smile never wavered, but something had changed in her eyes. They seemed deeper now, hollowed out, as if I were looking into empty wells. It's exactly what you need, Marcus. It's what everyone who stops here needs. The desert makes people so hot, so desperate, so willing to accept relief in any form. The temperature in the diner was dropping rapidly now. I could see my breath clearly, and frost was beginning to form on the windows. Helen moved with purpose behind the counter, pulling out more bowls, larger ones, and filling them with the same luminous ice. As she worked, she continued talking in that same pleasant, conversational tone. You'd be surprised how many people travel this road, she said, not looking up from her task. Truckers mostly, but others too. People running from things or toward things or just trying to find something they can't quite name. They all leave so satisfied, so peaceful. I was backing toward the door now, my hand fumbling for the handle while keeping my eyes on Helen. The ice in the bowl seemed to be glowing brighter, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. The water pooling beneath the melting cubes was definitely gray now, and getting darker by the moment. The wonderful thing about ice, Helen continued, finally looking up at me with those hollow, bottomless eyes, is that it preserves things so well, feelings, memories, the essence of a person. Nothing ever really goes bad when it's properly frozen. My hand finally found the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. The metal was so cold it burned my palm, and I could hear ice crystals crackling as they formed along the edges of the door frame. The address I never wrote. From Marcus Chen. The GPS died somewhere outside Millbrook, Arizona, leaving me with nothing but a handwritten address on a crumpled piece of paper and the steady hum of my Kenworth's engine cutting through the desert night. I'd been driving long haul for nearly 15 years, and I'd learned to trust my instincts about deliveries. But something about this particular run felt different from the moment I'd picked up the manifest back in Phoenix. The address was scrawled in blue ink on a torn piece of notebook paper, 847. Sagebrush Lane, Millbrook, AZ. What struck me as odd wasn't just the informal nature of the delivery slip, but the handwriting itself. It looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't place why. The letters were formed with the same deliberate care I remembered from my childhood, when teachers would make us practice cursive until our hands ached. My headlights carved through the darkness as I navigated the increasingly narrow roads leading into Millbrook. The town wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings and mobile homes scattered across the desert floor like discarded toys. Street signs were few and far between, their paint peeling and barely visible in the amber glow of the occasional streetlight that actually worked. The cargo I was hauling wasn't listed on any of my regular manifests. My dispatcher, Janet, had called me directly that afternoon while I was taking my mandatory rest break at a truck stop outside Tucson. She'd sounded rushed, almost nervous, which wasn't like her at all. Janet had been coordinating runs for 20 years, and nothing ever seemed to rattle her. "Marcus, I need you to make a quick detour," she'd said over the static-filled connection. "Nothing major, just a small delivery in Millbrook. The client specifically requested you." When I'd asked who the client was, Janet had paused for what felt like an eternity before simply saying, "Someone who knows you, I guess. They paid cash up front and said to tell you it was important." The package itself was unremarkable. A medium-sized cardboard box that weighed maybe 10 pounds and sat secured in the back of my trailer alongside my regular freight. But every time I thought about it during the drive, I felt a strange tingling sensation between my shoulder blades, like someone was watching me from behind now. Creeping through Millbrook's empty streets at nearly midnight, I found myself checking that handwritten address again and again. Each time I looked at it, the familiarity of the penmanship became more unsettling. The way the S in Sagebrush curled at the top, the slight rightward slant of all the letters, even the way the L in Lane was finished with a small flourish, it all reminded me of something I couldn't quite grasp. Sagebrush Lane turned out to be a dirt road that branched off from what passed for Millbrook's main street. My truck's air brakes hissed as I downshifted and turned onto the unpaved surface, feeling the 18 wheels find their grip in the loose gravel. The houses here were spaced far apart, dark shapes against the star-filled desert sky, most of them looking abandoned or nearly so. I counted the house numbers as I passed, their mailboxes illuminated briefly in my headlights before disappearing back into the darkness. 831, 839, 843. The numbers climbed steadily, but the houses themselves seemed to grow more dilapidated with each passing address. By the time I reached what should have been 847 Sagebrush Lane, my hands were gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. The house at 847 was different from its neighbors, not because it was in better condition, but because something about it seemed deliberately obscured. A tall wooden fence surrounded the property, and desert brush had grown up around it in such a way that the house itself was barely visible from the road. What I could see looked like a small ranch-style home with a composition shingle roof and vinyl siding that might have been white once upon a time. I pulled my rig to a stop at the end of the driveway, engine idling while I studied the property. There were no lights visible in any of the windows, no car in the driveway, no sign that anyone actually lived there. The only indication that this was indeed a residence was a small mailbox at the end of the drive, its red flag raised as if mail had been left for pickup. Something made me walk over to that mailbox before I retrieved the package from my trailer. Maybe it was professional curiosity, or maybe it was the growing sense of unease that had been building all evening. I lifted the metal flap and peered inside, using the flashlight app on my phone to illuminate the contents. There were 3 envelopes inside, all addressed to the same name, Marcus Chen, my name. My heart began beating faster as I pulled them out with trembling fingers. The return address on each envelope was the same, 847 Sagebrush Lane, Millbrook, AZ. But what made my mouth go dry was the handwriting. It was identical to the writing on the delivery address I'd been given. identical in every detail down to the same blue ink. I recognized the handwriting now, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. It was my own. The careful formation of each letter, the specific way I dotted my I's and crossed my T's, even the slight tremor in the end that had developed after I'd injured my right hand in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago. This was my handwriting, but I had never written these addresses, never been to this house before tonight, and certainly never mailed letters to myself. The envelopes weren't sealed, and inside each one was a single sheet of paper covered in more of that impossible, familiar handwriting. The first letter was dated 3 weeks ago and simply read, "Marcus, you need to make the delivery. Don't ask questions. Don't try to understand. Just bring the package to 847 Sagebrush Lane on November 15th at midnight. Your future depends on it." The second letter was dated a week later. "Marcus, I know you're reading this. I know you're confused. I was confused too when I first found the letters. But you have to trust the process. The package contains something that will save your life, even though you don't know you're in danger yet." The third letter was dated just 2 days ago. "Marcus, by the time you read this, you'll be standing in front of the house. You'll be frightened and you'll want to leave. Don't go inside. Leave the package on the kitchen table. Don't look inside it. Drive away and don't come back. Forget this ever happened, but remember that you saved yourself." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letters. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this had to be some kind of elaborate prank or psychological experiment. But the handwriting was too perfect, too exactly my own for that to be possible. Even a skilled forger would have missed some of the subtle quirks and unconscious habits that made a person's penmanship unique. I looked back toward my truck, then at the dark house, then at the letters again. Everything in my body was telling me to get back in the cab, put the truck in gear, and drive away from this place as fast as the speed limit would allow. But something stronger than fear was compelling me forward, a strange sense of obligation to myself, or to whatever version of myself had written these impossible letters. The package felt heavier as I carried it toward the house, though I knew that was just my imagination. The front gate in the wooden fence was unlocked and opened with a squeal of rusty hinges that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. A narrow gravel path led to the front door, flanked by overgrown desert sage and jumping cholla that caught at my jeans as I passed. The front door was also unlocked, opening into a small living room that smelled of dust and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet that I couldn't identify. My phone's flashlight beam revealed furniture covered in white sheets and a fine layer of desert dust that suggested the place had been empty for months, maybe years. The kitchen was toward the back of the house, a small galley-style room with outdated appliances and countertops that had probably been installed sometime in the 1980s. The table was a simple wooden affair, scarred and stained from years of use. Following the instructions in the letter, I placed the package in the center of the table and stepped back. That's when I noticed there was already something else on the table, something I'd missed in my initial sweep with the flashlight. It was another letter, this one sealed in an envelope with my name written across the front in that same impossible handwriting. My handwriting. I opened it with fingers that felt numb and disconnected from my body. Inside was a single sentence, "And now run. The convoy that never was." From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving nights on Interstate 80 is that you get to know the rhythm of the road, the way headlights dance in your mirrors like fireflies against the endless black. I've been hauling freight cross-country for 15 years, and that stretch between Nebraska and Wyoming has always been my favorite run. Wide open spaces, gentle grades, and usually just enough traffic to keep you company without crowding your lane. But 3 weeks ago, something changed on that familiar stretch of asphalt, and I'm still not sure what to make of it. It started on a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of crisp autumn evening where the air tastes like winter is just around the corner. My rig, a 2018 Peterbilt 389 with a sleeper cab I'd customized myself, was loaded down with electronics bound for Salt Lake City. The weight felt good under me, That solid connection between truck and trailer that tells you everything's balanced right. My CB was crackling with the usual chatter from other drivers. Weather reports mixing with complaints about DOT inspections and recommendations for the best coffee at upcoming truck stops. I was about 40 miles past North Platte when I first saw them in my side mirror. 4 trucks running in perfect formation, their headlights cutting through the darkness about a quarter mile behind me. Nothing unusual about that. Convoy running is common enough on the long hauls, drivers keeping each other company and watching for smokies. What caught my attention was how precise they were, maintaining exactly the same distance between each rig, their speeds perfectly matched. Even the most experienced drivers drift a little, speed up or slow down. But these trucks moved like they were connected by invisible cables. I keyed my CB to channel 19, the standard trucker frequency. The static cleared and I heard Moondog Charlie, a driver I'd known for years, complaining about construction delays near Cheyenne. A few other familiar voices chimed in. But when I asked about the convoy behind me, the radio went quiet for a moment before Charlie responded that he didn't see any group of trucks on his end. That struck me as odd since Charlie was running about 10 miles ahead of me, and convoys that tight usually announce themselves on the radio. The miles rolled by with that hypnotic rhythm that makes night driving both peaceful and dangerous. My dashboard lights cast their familiar green glow across the cab, and the steady rumble of my Cummins engine provided a bass note under the whisper of tires on asphalt. I kept checking my mirrors and the convoy was still there, still maintaining that impossible precision. As we climbed a long grade, I downshifted and watched my speed drop from 70 to 60, then to 55. The 4 trucks behind me matched my pace exactly, never gaining, never falling back. That's when I noticed something that made my scalp prickle. The lead truck in the convoy looked familiar, not just the make and model, but the specific arrangement of marker lights, the shape of the bug deflector, even what appeared to be a small dent in the right side of the hood. It looked exactly like my own rig. I told myself that was impossible, that plenty of Peterbilts look alike, especially at night when details blur together. But the more I stared into that mirror, the more convinced I became that I was looking at a perfect duplicate of my own truck. I tried the CB again, cycling through different channels, trying to raise the convoy. Channel 19 was still active with scattered conversations, but channels 17, 20, and 21 gave me nothing but static when I called out to the trucks behind me. On channel 13, I caught something strange, a conversation that seemed to echo my own voice. The transmission was scratchy and distant, but I could swear I heard someone who sounded like me discussing the same load I was carrying, mentioning the same delivery point in Salt Lake City. The highway curved through a series of gentle hills, and for a few moments the convoy disappeared behind the terrain. When the road straightened out again, they were still there, but now I could see them more clearly in the ambient light from a truck stop about 2 miles ahead. The lead truck wasn't just similar to mine. It was identical down to the custom exhaust stacks I'd installed last spring, and the small crack in the passenger side windshield that I kept meaning to replace. The driver was even wearing what looked like the same red flannel shirt I had on. My heart started hammering against my ribs, and I felt that cold sweat that comes with genuine fear. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my speed up to 75, then 80. The convoy matched my acceleration perfectly. When I backed off to 60, they slowed with me. It was like looking into a series of mirrors that reflected not just my truck, but my every decision. The truck stop ahead was a familiar one, Big Jim's Fuel and Food, where I'd stopped dozens of times over the years. The parking lot was moderately busy, maybe 20 trucks scattered across the spaces, their running lights twinkling like a small city. I decided to pull in, thinking that whatever was happening, it had to break the spell. Real trucks need real fuel, and real drivers need real coffee and real bathrooms. I took the off-ramp and curved around toward the fuel island, checking my mirrors as I made the turn. The convoy had taken the same exit, following me with that same eerie precision. But as I pulled up to the diesel pump and set my air brakes, something impossible happened. The 4 trucks behind me simply faded away like smoke, becoming transparent and then disappearing entirely. The parking lot looked exactly as it had when I'd first seen it. The same 20 trucks in the same positions, as if the convoy had never existed at all. I sat in my cab for a long moment, engine idling, trying to process what I'd just seen. The logical part of my mind insisted that I'd been hallucinating, that too many nights on the road had finally caught up with me. Highway hypnosis was a real thing, and maybe I'd fallen into some kind of waking dream. I climbed down from the cab, my legs shaky, and started pumping diesel while I tried to convince myself that was all it had been. Inside the truck stop, the usual collection of drivers was scattered around the restaurant, nursing coffee and working on plates of food that looked better than it probably tasted. I recognized a few faces and nodded hello, trying to act normal while my mind kept replaying those 4 identical trucks. At the coffee station, I ran into Moondog Charlie, a grizzled veteran in his 60s who'd been driving since before CB radios were standard equipment. Charlie looked at me with concern, noting the probably obvious stress on my face. When I described what I'd seen, keeping my voice low, he set down his coffee cup and studied me with the serious expression he usually reserved for discussions of ice storms and brake failures. He told me about something similar that had happened to him about 20 years ago on I-10 through Texas. A convoy of trucks that looked like his own rig, following him for over 100 miles before vanishing at a rest stop. According to Charlie, he'd done some research afterward and found scattered reports of similar incidents, always involving night drivers on long, lonely stretches of highway. Some truckers called them echo convoys, manifestations that appeared when a driver had been running the same route for so many years that their presence had somehow worn a groove in reality itself. Charlie didn't claim to understand the mechanics of it, but he was convinced it was more than just highway hypnosis or exhaustion-induced hallucinations. I finished my fuel stop and got back on I-80, hoping that whatever had happened was over. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and normal, with just the occasional pair of headlights in the distance. My CB chattered with routine traffic, and the familiar rhythm of night driving gradually settled my nerves. For about 30 miles, everything felt normal again. Then I saw them in my mirrors once more. 4 trucks in perfect formation, their headlights steady and unwavering. This time I was ready, or thought I was. I grabbed my CB microphone and started cycling through channels systematically, trying to make contact. On channel 13, I caught that strange echo transmission again. Clearer this time. It was definitely my voice, but the conversation was wrong. Talking about deliveries I'd made months ago, mentioning weather conditions that didn't match the clear night around me. As I listened, a terrible possibility occurred to me. What if the convoy wasn't following me? What if I was part of it? The voice on channel 13 was discussing a route that was slightly different from mine, taking an exit that was still 15 miles ahead. If I was somehow seeing an echo of my own past runs, then maybe other versions of me were out there, running slightly different variations of the same endless route. I tested the theory by changing lanes, moving from the right lane to the left. In my mirror, the convoy shifted with me, but with a delay of about 10 seconds, as if my movement was rippling backward through time. The Living Highway, from Marcus Chen. There's a stretch of Interstate 80 through Nevada that doesn't appear on any official maps, though plenty of us long-haul drivers know about it. It only opens up after midnight, and only when the desert wind is blowing just right, carrying that strange metallic taste that makes your teeth ache. I've driven that phantom mile exactly 3 times in my 15 years behind the wheel of my Freightliner, and each time I swore it would be the last. But the road has a way of calling you back, especially when the regular routes start feeling too familiar, too safe. The first time I found it was purely by accident. I'd been pushing hard through the Nevada desert, trying to make Sacramento before dawn with a load of computer parts. The night was clear and cold, the kind where the stars look close enough to pluck from the sky, and my CB had gone quiet hours ago. Even the usual chatter from other night runners had faded to static. The monotonous hum of my diesel engine and the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt had lulled me into that meditative state we drivers know well, where miles disappear without conscious thought. That's when I noticed the exit that shouldn't have been there. Mile marker 247, a simple concrete ramp curving away into darkness unmarked by any signage. I almost missed it entirely, caught it only in my peripheral vision as a break in the endless fence line. My hands turned the wheel before my brain could question the decision. Some deeper instinct recognizing an opportunity for a shortcut back to the main interstate. The off-ramp was smooth beneath my wheels, recently paved, though I couldn't recall any construction in this area. The road that stretched ahead looked ordinary enough at first glance. Standard 2-lane blacktop, yellow lines crisp and bright in my headlights, shoulders properly maintained with fresh gravel. But as I settled into the gentle curves that wound between low desert hills, I began to notice subtle details that didn't quite fit. The asphalt had an unusual sheen to it, almost organic, like wet skin under moonlight. My headlights seemed to penetrate deeper into the surface than they should, as if the road itself was somehow translucent. The temperature gauge on my dashboard began fluctuating slightly. Not enough to be concerning, but enough to catch my attention. The needle would rise a degree or two, then fall back, in a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. I checked my mirrors and saw nothing but darkness behind me, the road receding into a black void that seemed to swallow my taillight's red glow. Ahead, the yellow lines continued their hypnotic parade through my windshield, perfectly straight now, leading toward a horizon I couldn't quite make out. Miles passed in that strange, dreamlike state that comes with night driving, where time becomes fluid and distance loses meaning. But gradually I began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with this stretch of highway. The road beneath my truck was moving, not the normal sensation of motion from driving, but an actual undulation as if I were traveling across the back of some massive sleeping creature. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible through the truck's suspension, but unmistakably there. I eased off the accelerator, dropping from 70 to 60, then to 50 miles per hour. The slower I went, the more pronounced the sensation became. The road surface rose and fell in long, slow waves that seemed to match the rhythm I'd noticed in my temperature gauge. Through the steering wheel, I could feel a pulsing vibration that had nothing to do with my engine's normal operation. It was organic, steady, hypnotic, like a heartbeat. The CB radio crackled to life suddenly, startling me from my growing unease. But instead of the familiar voices of other drivers, what came through the speaker was a sound I'd never heard before. It was breathing, slow and deep, with an almost liquid quality that made my skin crawl. I reached for the volume control, but before I could turn it down, the sound faded back to static. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pregnant with unseen presence. Outside my windows, the desert landscape had changed. Where before there had been the familiar scrub brush and rocky outcroppings of Nevada, now I saw what looked like vast fields of something that might have been vegetation. If vegetation could pulse and writhe in patterns that hurt to look at directly, the formations rose and fell in synchronized waves, keeping perfect time with the road's undulations beneath my wheels. In the distance, structures that might have been hills or buildings caught fragments of starlight, their surfaces too smooth and regular to be natural. My fuel gauge hadn't moved since I'd entered this stretch of highway, despite covering what felt like dozens of miles. The odometer continued to turn over normally, but when I tried to calculate how long I'd been driving, my mind seemed to slide away from the numbers. Time itself felt different here, stretched and compressed simultaneously. I checked my watch and found the hands moving in irregular jerks, sometimes forward, sometimes back, never keeping proper rhythm. The road began to narrow gradually, the yellow lines drawing closer together with each mile. My truck, which had felt perfectly scaled to the highway when I'd first entered, now seemed almost too wide for the lane. I had to concentrate to keep the wheels tracking properly, fighting a growing sense that the road was consciously guiding my path, steering me toward some predetermined destination I couldn't see but felt approaching with inevitable certainty. That's when I noticed the other vehicles. They appeared first as distant lights in my rear-view mirrors, white headlamp beams that kept perfect pace with my own speed no matter how I varied it. When I accelerated, they accelerated. When I slowed, they slowed, maintaining exactly the same distance behind me. I counted at least 6 sets of lights, possibly more, following in single file like a funeral procession through the pulsing darkness. Ahead, more lights appeared, red taillights that should have been moving away from me, but instead maintained their position on the horizon like fixed stars. I began to understand that I had become part of something larger, a circulation system of vehicles moving through arteries of living asphalt. The road beneath my wheels pulsed stronger now, unmistakably rhythmic, as if responding to the increased traffic flow. The CB came alive again, this time carrying voices that spoke in languages I'd never heard, consonants that seemed to twist in the air and vowels that resonated in frequencies that made my bones ache. Between the alien words, I caught fragments of English, whispered reports from other drivers describing impossible landscapes and roads that led to destinations that existed on no earthly map. One voice, distorted by static, mentioned driving the same route for decades without aging, without stopping, following the pulse of highways that existed between spaces. My hands began to shake on the steering wheel as the full implications of my situation became clear. This wasn't just a shortcut or a forgotten stretch of interstate. This was something else entirely. A road that existed in the gaps between reality, powered by forces that had nothing to do with human engineering. The asphalt beneath my wheels was alive, connected to a vast network that spanned distances beyond geographic measurement. The yellow lines began to glow more brightly, taking on a phosphorescent quality that pulsed in sync with the road's heartbeat. In that eerie illumination, I could see that the lines weren't painted on the surface but were actually embedded within it, like veins carrying some luminous vital fluid. The road was feeding, I realized with growing horror, drawing energy from the vehicles that traveled its length, sustaining itself on the motion and momentum of travelers who thought they were simply taking a shortcut. Panic finally broke through my fascination, flooding my system with adrenaline that cut through the hypnotic spell of the pulsing highway. I began looking desperately for an exit, any break in the endless procession of yellow lines that would let me escape back to normal roads. But the landscape on either side had become uniformly alien, those writhing fields extending to horizons that curved in directions that defied perspective. There were no off-ramps, no intersections, no breaks in the organic barriers that channeled traffic along predetermined paths. Then, just when despair began to overwhelm my determination, I saw it, a gap in the pattern, a place where the road's rhythm faltered slightly, creating a momentary weakness in whatever force held vehicles to their designated lanes. Without hesitation, I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, feeling the truck's weight shift as I fought against an invisible current that tried to pull me back into line. The wheels left the pulsing asphalt and hit ordinary gravel with a jar that rattled every bolt in the cab. I found myself on a familiar stretch of Interstate 80, the real Interstate 80, with normal mile markers and regulation signage, my CB immediately filled with standard trucker chatter, mundane conversations about weather and load schedules that sounded like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. In my mirrors, I saw only empty highway stretching back into darkness. No sign of the living road or the convoy of trapped vehicles that had followed me through that impossible landscape. The Pendulum Crossing, from Marcus Rivera. The GPS on my Peterbilt's dashboard flickered between satellite signals as I navigated the winding mountain roads of eastern Kentucky, hauling a load of manufacturing equipment bound for a factory that had probably seen better decades. The autumn rain had been my companion for the last 100 miles, drumming steadily against the windshield while my wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. It was nearly 3 in the morning, and the world outside my cab had shrunk to whatever my headlights could carve from the darkness. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, but tonight felt different somehow. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, occasionally picking up fragments of distant conversations or late-night gospel programs before dissolving back into white noise. The engine's steady rumble provided a comforting counterpoint to the rain, and I found myself humming along to keep the drowsiness at bay. The road ahead curved sharply to the left, following the contours of what my map indicated was Miller's Gorge, a deep ravine that cut through this part of the mountains like a wound. I'd crossed bridges over similar gorges countless times before, but as my headlights swept across the guardrail and revealed the approaching span, something made me ease off the accelerator. The bridge looked wrong, though I couldn't immediately place why. It stretched across the chasm in a graceful arc, its surface appearing to be standard asphalt. But there was something about the way it seemed to move in my peripheral vision that set my teeth on edge. I chalked it up to the rain and the late hour playing tricks with my perception, but as I drew closer, the feeling only intensified. The structure itself appeared to be a modern cable-stayed design, with twin towers rising from either end and support cables stretching down to the deck, like the ribs of some sleeping giant. But those cables seemed to shift and sway with a rhythm that didn't match the wind. The rain was falling straight down now, barely a breeze to speak of. Yet the entire bridge appeared to rock gently back and forth like a suspension bridge made of rope and planks. I brought the truck to a stop about 50 yards from the bridge's entrance, letting the engine idle while I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The headlights illuminated the span clearly now, and I could see that the surface was indeed swaying, not dramatically, but with a slow, hypnotic motion that reminded me of a rope bridge I'd once crossed during a hiking trip in Nepal. The difference was that this wasn't supposed to be a rope bridge. This was supposed to be solid concrete and steel, designed to handle the weight of vehicles far heavier than my rig. I grabbed the CB radio, hoping to raise another driver who might have recent experience with this crossing. The static cleared momentarily, and I transmitted on channel 19, identifying myself and requesting information about the bridge ahead. The response came back immediately, clear as crystal. "That's the Pendulum Crossing, driver. Nothing to worry about. Built flexible to handle the wind shear through the gorge. Just take it slow and steady and don't look down at the water while you're crossing." The voice was calm and professional, exactly what I needed to hear. But something about it bothered me. The timing had been too perfect, the response too immediate, as if whoever was on the other end had been waiting for my call. I tried to follow up with questions about weight limits and recent conditions, but the static had returned, swallowing my transmission into the electronic void. I put the truck back in gear and approached the bridge slowly, my trailer's air brakes hissing softly as I controlled our speed. The closer I got, the more pronounced the swaying became. The entire structure moved with a gentle, pendulum-like motion that made my stomach lurch with each oscillation. The rain had begun to pool on the deck's surface, and I could see small waves forming in the standing water as the bridge rocked back and forth. The moment my front wheels touched the bridge deck, I felt the motion translate through the truck's suspension. It wasn't violent or dangerous, just deeply unsettling, like being on a ferry in calm seas. The cab swayed gently from side to side, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. My cargo, secured though it was, began to shift slightly with each movement, creating small groans and creaks from the trailer behind me. I kept my speed steady at about 15 miles per hour, focusing on the center line and trying to ignore the way the bridge's motion seemed to be affecting my inner ear. The span was longer than it had appeared from the approach, stretching out ahead of me like a rhythmic, undulating ribbon suspended over the invisible depth of the gorge. My headlights caught the guide cables as they swayed, creating shifting patterns of shadow and light across the wet roadway. About halfway across, I made the mistake of glancing to my right, toward the gorge's far wall. My headlights couldn't penetrate far enough to illuminate the bottom, but I could see the rocky sides descending into absolute blackness. More disturbing was the way the darkness seemed to move, flowing like thick liquid between the stone walls. I forced myself to look back at the road ahead, but the image stayed with me, a sense of something vast and hungry waiting in the depths below. The radio crackled to life again, and the same voice from before spoke with that unnaturally calm tone. "How's the crossing treating you, driver? Beautiful night for a drive through the mountains." I keyed the mic, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "Bridge is moving quite a bit more than I expected. How long has it been built this way?" The response came immediately, but now I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was no road noise in the background of the transmission, no engine sound or wind or rain. The voice existed in perfect sterile silence, as if it were being broadcast from somewhere completely removed from the physical world I was navigating. "The pendulum crossing has always moved like that, driver. It's designed to flex with the natural forces, just like a tree that bends in the wind instead of breaking. You're doing fine. Keep that steady pace." I didn't respond, focusing instead on the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. The bridge's motion had become more pronounced as I progressed toward the center of the span, and now I could feel the deck actually dropping slightly with each swing to the left, rising as it swung back to the right. It was as if the entire structure were suspended from a single point, like a massive pendulum, defying the laws of engineering and physics. My trailer began to jackknife slightly with each oscillation, forcing me to make constant steering corrections to keep the rig aligned with the roadway. The rain continued to fall, but now it seemed to be falling at an angle that didn't match the bridge's motion, creating an optical illusion that made me feel as if I were moving through space rather than across a stationary span. The darkness on either side of the bridge had taken on a quality that went beyond the simple absence of light. It felt thick and heavy, pressing against the windows of my cab like something with substance and weight. When I tried to look directly into it, my vision seemed to slide away, unable to focus on anything concrete. It was as if the night itself had become something alive and aware, watching my progress with malevolent interest. 3/4 of the way across, the swaying motion reached a crescendo that had me seriously considering stopping the truck entirely. The bridge was now moving through an arc that had to be at least 10 feet wide, swinging back and forth with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. Each time we reached the peak of the swing to the left, I could feel the truck's weight shifting toward the guardrail, and each swing to the right brought us uncomfortably close to the opposite edge. That's when I noticed the other vehicles. They appeared in my mirrors first. A convoy of headlights approaching the bridge from behind me. I couldn't make out the specific makes and models, but there had to be at least half a dozen trucks following in my wake, all maintaining the same careful speed as they navigated the swaying span. The sight should have been reassuring, proof that other drivers regularly used this crossing. But something about the perfect uniformity of their spacing and speed filled me with dread. I keyed the CB again, trying to raise one of the drivers behind me. "This is the Peterbilt leading the convoy across the pendulum crossing. Can any of you drivers behind me confirm your position?" The response came not from behind me, but from the radio in that same unnaturally calm voice. "All drivers are accounted for, Marcus. Everyone is exactly where they need to be. Just keep moving forward. You're almost across now." The voice had used my name, though I hadn't given it during any of my transmissions. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cab's weather stripping. I checked my mirrors again, and the headlights were still there, still maintaining that perfect, impossible formation as they swayed back and forth with the bridge's motion. The Midnight Merge. From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving nights on Interstate 70 through Kansas is that you start to think the road owns you after a while, not the other way around. Mile markers blur past like counting sheep, and the endless ribbon of asphalt becomes a lullaby that hums through your bones. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Denver to Kansas City for 3 years. Same route, same stops, same truck stop coffee that tasted like burnt disappointment. My Peterbilt 379 and I had developed an understanding. She'd keep me safe through the darkest hours, and I'd keep her diesel tank full and her chrome polished. That particular October night started like any other. Rain had been threatening all evening, those heavy gray clouds that hang low and make the air taste metallic. By the time I passed the Salina exit, fat droplets were drumming against my windshield in a steady rhythm that matched the thrum of my engine. The wipers swept back and forth with their hypnotic cadence, clearing away sheets of water that caught my headlight beams like scattered diamonds. Radio chatter was sparse, just the occasional trucker reporting road conditions or asking about way stations ahead. I was making good time despite the weather. Cruise control set at a steady 65. When I first noticed something peculiar in my passenger side mirror, headlights were approaching from behind, which wasn't unusual, but there was something wrong with their positioning. They seemed too high, too widely spaced, like they belonged to something much larger than a standard vehicle. As they drew closer, I could see they weren't following the normal traffic pattern. Instead of staying in the right lane to pass or maintaining a safe following distance, they appeared to be weaving slightly, drifting between lanes in a way that made my jaw clench. The rain was intensifying, turning from steady drops to a proper downpour that reduced visibility to maybe 100 yards ahead. My CB crackled with static, picking up fragments of distant conversations that faded in and out like ghost voices. I adjusted my mirrors and kept one eye on those approaching headlights. They were definitely gaining on me, and as they came closer, I could make out the distinctive silhouette of another big rig, but something about its movement struck me as odd. There was an erratic quality to how it maintained its lane position, subtle but enough to put me on edge. When the truck finally pulled alongside me in the left lane, I glanced over expecting to see a fellow driver perhaps struggling with the weather conditions. What I saw instead made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The cab of the other truck was completely dark. No interior lights, no glow from dashboard instruments, nothing to indicate human presence. The windows were so heavily tinted or fogged that I couldn't make out any details of who might be behind the wheel. Most unsettling of all, the truck appeared to be a mirror image of my own Peterbilt, down to the same chrome details and even what looked like identical running lights. The mysterious truck maintained its position beside me for several miles, matching my speed exactly. Every time I adjusted my cruise control, either faster or slower, it would adjust accordingly within seconds. When I signaled to change lanes, it would drift slightly in the same direction as if anticipating my movement. The whole situation was beginning to feel like some elaborate game, but I couldn't fathom what the other driver's purpose might be. The radio remained stubbornly silent despite my attempts to raise anyone on Channel 19. As we crested a long, gentle hill, the highway ahead stretched out before us in a series of rolling curves that disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, perhaps a mile ahead, I could see headlights approaching in what should have been the opposing traffic lanes. But these weren't normal headlights. They were positioned wrong, sitting where the right lane should be instead of the left. It was as if an oncoming vehicle was driving directly toward us in our own lane. I immediately reached for my CB radio, intending to warn other traffic about the wrong-way driver. But before I could key the microphone, I realized something even more disturbing. The mysterious truck beside me was beginning to drift into my lane, forcing me toward the shoulder. Its massive bulk was slowly but inexorably pushing me to the right, leaving me no choice but to reduce speed and drop back. As I did, I watched in the glow of my headlights as the other truck moved fully into my lane and continued ahead. The approaching headlights were getting closer, and now I could see they definitely belonged to another large truck. The situation was rapidly becoming a nightmare scenario. Two big rigs heading directly toward each other in the same lane with nowhere to go. I grabbed my radio and shouted warnings, but received only static in response. My hands were sweating despite the air conditioning, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs as I watched what seemed like an inevitable collision approaching. But as the two trucks drew near each other, something impossible happened. Instead of the grinding crash of metal and the explosion of glass I was bracing myself for, the trucks simply passed through one another like shadows merging in the dark. For a brief moment, the headlights of both vehicles occupied the same space, creating a blinding aurora of white light that made me squint and look away. When I looked back, there was only one set of headlights continuing toward me. The wrong-way truck was now bearing down on my position. Panic flooded my system as I realized I was now the target. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, feeling my trailer sway dangerously as I fought to get onto the shoulder. The approaching truck seemed to accelerate, its headlights growing larger and brighter until they filled my entire field of vision. At the last possible second, I felt rather than saw it rush past my driver's side, so close that my truck shuddered in the displaced air. The sound wasn't the rumble of a diesel engine, though it was something else entirely, a whistling, hollow noise like wind through a canyon. I managed to bring my rig to a controlled stop on the shoulder, hands shaking as I set the air brakes. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the idle of my engine. Behind me, the road was empty. No taillights, no sign that another vehicle had ever been there. Ahead, the highway stretched into darkness with no trace of the mysterious truck that had started this whole encounter. It was as if both vehicles had simply vanished into the rain-soaked night. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes trying to process what I'd experienced while rain continued to hammer my windshield. Eventually, other traffic began to appear. Normal cars and trucks that behaved exactly as they should, staying in their proper lanes and responding to radio calls. I pulled back onto the highway and continued toward Kansas City, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something that existed outside the normal rules of physics. The rest of my run passed without incident, but I found myself constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the road ahead for any sign of those phantom trucks. When I finally reached my destination and backed up to the loading dock, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink. In the growing daylight, the events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike. Too strange to have actually happened, but when I walked around my truck to complete my post-trip inspection, I found something that made my blood freeze. There, along the entire length of my passenger side, was a series of scratches in the paint and chrome. They weren't deep gouges or impact damage. They looked more like frost patterns, delicate traceries that caught the morning light like silver spider webs. And they were still cold to the touch, so cold that my fingers went numb when I traced their paths. I've made that same run dozens of times since then, always watching, always listening to the radio chatter for any mention of wrong-way drivers or phantom trucks. Sometimes when the rain is heavy and visibility is poor, I think I catch glimpses of headlights where they shouldn't be, but I've never again seen those mirror image trucks or experienced anything quite like that night on Interstate 70. The scratches on my truck have never faded. Despite multiple attempts to buff them out or repaint over them, they serve as a constant reminder that there are things moving on our highways that don't follow the same rules as the rest of us. Phantom travelers that exist in the spaces between lanes, in the darkness between headlight beams, waiting for the right conditions to make themselves known to the living. The Gregorian Highway. From Marcus Reed. The first time I heard my Peterbilt's engine speak Latin, I was hauling a load of religious artifacts from a monastery in New Mexico to a museum in Denver. It was near midnight on a stretch of highway so desolate that even the GPS seemed uncertain about where exactly we were. The asphalt stretched ahead like a black river under the pale glow of my headlights, and the only sound for miles had been the familiar rumble of my diesel engine, a comforting mechanical heartbeat that had accompanied me through 15 years of long-haul trucking. I'd picked up the shipment just after sunset from Brother Augustine, an elderly monk whose weathered hands trembled slightly as he helped secure the cargo. The items were carefully wrapped and cataloged, centuries-old crucifixes, illuminated manuscripts sealed in climate-controlled cases, and several ornate reliquaries that contained what the manifest cryptically described as blessed remains. The brother had been unusually quiet during the loading process, offering only brief explanations about proper handling and temperature requirements. As I prepared to leave, he placed a gnarled hand on my truck's hood and whispered what sounded like a prayer. Though I couldn't make out the words, the highway carved through high desert terrain, bordered by ancient mesas that loomed like sleeping giants against the star-scattered sky. My CB radio had fallen silent hours ago, picking up nothing but static and the occasional distant conversation in Spanish that faded before I could tune it properly. The isolation didn't bother me usually. In fact, I preferred these quiet runs where the only company was my thoughts and the steady rhythm of rubber on asphalt. But something felt different tonight, as though the darkness beyond my headlight beams was thicker, more substantial, pressing against the windows with an almost physical weight. The change in my engine sound was so gradual that I almost didn't notice it at first. The familiar rumble began to develop an odd cadence, a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be mechanical. I eased off the throttle and listened more carefully, my trained ear searching for signs of trouble. The rhythm continued, rising and falling in what almost sounded like chanting. I shook my head and reached for my thermos of coffee, telling myself that fatigue was playing tricks with my perception. Engines don't chant, they run rough, they knock, they ping, but they don't produce sounds that could be mistaken for human voices. But as the miles rolled by, the pattern became more distinct, more undeniably vocal. The deep bass notes of my diesel engine were arranging themselves into syllables, into words, into what I slowly began to recognize as Latin phrases. I'd heard enough of them during my Catholic childhood to identify the language, even if I couldn't translate the meaning. The sounds seemed to emanate from deep within the engine compartment, reverberating through the cab with a resonance that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. My temperature gauges all showed normal readings. The oil pressure was steady, but something was definitely not right. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the highway and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive after hours of mechanical noise, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant howl of wind across the desert. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out to inspect the engine compartment, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange sounds. Perhaps debris had gotten caught in the cooling fan, or a loose belt was creating unusual vibrations. Under the hood, everything appeared normal. The massive diesel engine sat in its bay like a sleeping beast, all hoses and connections secure, fluids at proper levels, no obvious signs of distress. I tried starting the engine again, and it fired immediately with its usual healthy roar. For a moment I thought whatever had been causing the odd sounds had resolved itself. But as I pulled back onto the highway and settled into cruising speed, the Latin chanting resumed, now even more clearly articulated. The words seemed to follow a liturgical pattern, rising and falling like responses in a church service. I found myself unconsciously holding my breath during the pauses, as though waiting for a congregation to respond to some unseen priest. The cargo area behind me remained silent, but I caught myself glancing repeatedly in my mirrors, half expecting to see movement among the secured artifacts. The reliquaries in particular drew my attention, their ornate silver and gold surfaces catching occasional glimpses of light from passing mile markers. Brother Augustine had mentioned that some of the items dated back to the 13th century, blessed by saints whose names were lost to history. The monastery had been their guardian for generations, and now I was transporting them to their new home in a climate-controlled museum display. As the night wore on, the Latin chanting from my engine grew more complex, developing harmonies that seemed impossible for a single mechanical source to produce. Multiple voices seemed to be singing in careful counterpoint, creating a sacred chorus that transformed my truck cab into something resembling a mobile cathedral. The strangest part was how beautiful it sounded despite its impossible origin. The voices carried a profound sense of peace and reverence, as though generations of monks were offering their prayers through the medium of my diesel engine. I began to recognize certain phrases that had survived from childhood masses, Kyrie eleison and Gloria in excelsis, but most of the chanting was in older forms of Latin that predated my limited knowledge. The melody lines wove together with mathematical precision, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate not just in my ears, but in some deeper part of my consciousness. Despite the supernatural strangeness of the situation, I found myself oddly comforted by the celestial music, as though my truck had become a vessel for something sacred and timeless. The highway began to climb toward a mountain pass, and my engine worked harder to maintain speed on the steepening grade. The Latin chanting adjusted to the increased effort, becoming more urgent, more intense, like prayers offered in times of great need. Through my windshield, I could see storm clouds gathering around the mountain peaks ahead, illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning that revealed their towering height and ominous density. The weather radio crackled with warnings about severe thunderstorms and possible tornado activity, but the closest alternate route would add 6 hours to my delivery schedule. As the first raindrops began to spatter against my windshield, the chanting from my engine took on a distinctly protective quality, like a blessing being pronounced over dangerous territory. The voices seemed to be asking for safe passage, for protection from the storm that was rapidly building ahead. I turned on my wipers and reduced my speed as the rain intensified, transforming from scattered drops into sheets of water that made the road barely visible beyond the reach of my headlights. The wind hit us like a physical blow as we crested the mountain pass, buffeting my truck with gusts that made steering a constant struggle. Through the storm, I caught glimpses of twisted metal along the roadside, the remains of vehicles that had lost their battle with the mountain weather. The Latin chanting grew even more intense, multiple voices now singing with desperate urgency, as though pleading with divine powers for continued protection. Lightning struck close enough to illuminate the entire mountainside, revealing a landscape that looked more like the surface of an alien world than anything terrestrial. But somehow, impossibly, my truck continued to find traction on the rain-slicked asphalt. The engine never faltered, even when visibility dropped to nearly zero and the wind threatened to push us off the narrow mountain highway. The chanting voices seemed to be guiding us through the storm, providing an audible beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. Each gust of wind, each flash of lightning, each moment when the road disappeared entirely beneath flowing water, was met with renewed intensity from the sacred chorus emanating from my engine compartment. As we descended the far side of the pass, the storm began to lose its fury, the rain diminishing from torrential downpour to steady shower to occasional sprinkle. The Latin chanting gradually grew softer as well, returning to the peaceful, meditative tones I had first noticed hours earlier. By the time I reached the valley floor, the sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, and the voices from my engine had faded to barely audible whispers, like prayers offered in the final moments before sleep. I delivered my cargo to the Denver Museum, just as they opened for business, helping the curators carefully unload each precious artifact. The reliquaries seemed especially beautiful in the morning light, their ancient metals glowing with an inner warmth that spoke of centuries of devoted craftsmanship. As I secured the last load strap and prepared my paperwork, one of the curators mentioned that several of the items had come from a monastery famous for its Gregorian chant, a sacred musical tradition that had been preserved unchanged for nearly 1,000 years. I never told them about my engine's performance during the night crossing. They would have thought me delusional, and I had no proof beyond my own experience. But as I drove my empty truck back toward the highway, I found myself hoping that someday I might carry another such sacred cargo, and perhaps hear again those impossible voices that had guided me safely through the storm. The engine ran normally now, producing nothing more than its usual mechanical rumble. The reflection route, from Marcus Chen. The thing about driving the same routes for 15 years is that you start to notice when something changes, even the smallest detail that would escape a casual observer. I've been hauling freight across the Pacific Northwest since I was 23, and Highway 101 between Portland and Eugene has become as familiar to me as the creaking sounds my Peterbilt makes when the temperature drops. That's why when I spotted the exit around mile marker 47 on that foggy October night, I knew immediately that something was wrong. It wasn't supposed to be there. The fog had rolled in thick around 10:30, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and uncertain. My headlights could barely penetrate 20 feet ahead, and the usual landmarks that helped me gauge my progress had vanished into the gray void. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, occasionally picking up fragments of distant conversations that seemed to fade in and out like whispers. I'd driven through plenty of fog before, but this felt different somehow. Heavier, as if it carried weight beyond mere water vapor. I was maintaining a steady 55 miles per hour. My hands relaxed on the steering wheel when the exit appeared in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the fog in my headlights, but as I drew closer, the off-ramp became unmistakably real. What made it immediately wrong was the complete absence of any exit sign. Instead, where the familiar green highway sign should have been, a large rectangular mirror hung suspended from the metal framework, its surface reflecting my truck's headlights back at me in a blinding flash. The reflection was perfect, too perfect. I could see every detail of my Peterbilt's front end, every scratch on the chrome bumper, every bug splatter on the windshield. But something about the image made my stomach tighten with unease. It wasn't just seeing my own truck mirrored back at me, though that was strange enough. It was the way the reflection seemed to lag just a fraction of a second behind reality, as if the mirror was showing me not what was, but what had been a moment before. I slowed down, my curiosity overriding the voice in my head that was urging me to keep driving. The exit ramp curved away to the right, disappearing into the fog after about 50 yards. There were no other mirrors visible along the guardrails, no explanation for why this one massive reflective surface had been installed where an exit sign should be. The framework holding it looked standard, the same galvanized steel construction used for highway signage throughout Oregon. But the mirror itself seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that defied the physics I understood. As I idled on the shoulder, studying the mysterious exit, I noticed movement in the mirror's reflection. At first, I thought it was just the natural sway of my truck responding to the wind. But then I realized the movement was happening behind my reflected vehicle. There appeared to be another truck approaching in the mirror, its headlights growing brighter as it drew closer. I immediately checked my side mirrors and glanced over my shoulder, but the highway behind me was empty, swallowed by fog and darkness. When I looked back at the exit mirror, the approaching truck in the reflection was much closer now, close enough that I could make out details. It was a Peterbilt like mine, the same model year, the same blue and silver paint scheme, even the same company logos on the cab doors. The coincidence sent a chill down my spine. But what truly unsettled me was the realization that I was looking at an exact duplicate of my own truck, approaching from behind in a reflection that showed a highway that didn't match reality. The reflected version of the highway behind me was clear and bright, free of fog, with perfect visibility stretching back for miles. I could see every painted line, every reflector, every detail of the asphalt surface. It was Highway 101, but it was Highway 101 as it appeared on clear summer nights, not the fog-choked road I was actually traveling. The other truck, my truck's twin, was maintaining a steady speed and showed no signs of slowing as it approached my position. I found myself transfixed by the approaching duplicate, watching as it grew larger in the impossible reflection. The driver's side window was dark, tinted too heavily for me to make out who was behind the wheel. But something about the truck's movement seemed purposeful, as if the person driving knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do when they arrived. My hands had begun to sweat despite the cool October air, and I realized I was holding my breath as I watched the strange scene unfold. The duplicate truck was now close enough in the reflection that I should have been able to hear its engine, should have felt the vibration of its approach through my own vehicle. But the night remained eerily quiet except for the gentle rumble of my own diesel engine. The fog continued to swirl around my actual truck, but in the mirror's reflection, the air was crystalline clear, allowing me to see details that should have been impossible to discern. That's when I noticed the driver. As the reflected truck pulled alongside my reflected position, the heavily tinted window began to roll down, revealing the cab's interior. What I saw inside made every instinct I possessed scream at me to leave immediately. The driver was me, but not exactly me. It was as if someone had created a version of Marcus Chen from slightly distorted memories, getting most of the details right but missing subtle elements that only I would notice. The reflection of the other me was wearing the same flannel shirt I had on, the same baseball cap, even the same wire-rimmed glasses, but his expression was wrong. The other Marcus was smiling, but it wasn't any smile I'd ever worn. It was too wide, too knowing, tinged with a malevolence that made my skin crawl. His eyes, my eyes, were focused directly on the mirror, meeting my gaze with an intensity that felt almost physical. As I watched in growing horror, the other Marcus raised his right hand and pointed directly at the exit ramp, then at me, then at the ramp again. The message was unmistakable. He wanted me to take the exit. Every rational part of my mind was telling me to put the truck in gear and drive away as fast as safely possible. But I found myself unable to look away from the mirror. The other Marcus had reached over to his passenger seat and picked up what appeared to be a CB radio microphone. He brought it to his lips and began speaking, though I couldn't hear any transmission coming through my own radio. However, I could read his lips well enough to understand what he was saying, the same phrase repeated over and over. Come find me. Come find me. Come find me. The fog around my actual truck began to shift and swirl more violently, as if responding to some unseen force. In the mirror's reflection, however, the clear night remained perfectly calm. The other Marcus had put down the CB microphone and was now leaning out his window, gesturing more emphatically toward the exit ramp. His smile had grown even wider, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp, too numerous for a human mouth. I forced myself to look away from the mirror and focus on my truck's controls. My hands were shaking as I reached for the gear shift. But before I could engage drive, my CB radio crackled to life with a burst of static that resolved into a voice. It was my own voice, but speaking words I wasn't saying. Marcus, you need to take the exit. You need to come find what's waiting for you. You've been driving the wrong road for too long. The transmission continued, my own voice speaking impossible words while I sat in stunned silence. The exit will take you where you really need to go. The place you've been looking for without realizing you were searching. The fog isn't hiding you from something, Marcus. It's hiding something from you. Take the exit and see what's been waiting. I grabbed my own CB microphone and keyed it, shouting into the receiver. Who is this? What do you want? But my words seemed to be absorbed by the fog the moment they left the radio. Meanwhile, the transmission from my duplicate continued, increasingly urgent. Take the exit, Marcus. Take the exit before the fog clears. Before the mirror stops showing you the truth. This is your only chance to find the right road. In the mirror's reflection, the other Marcus had climbed down from his truck and was walking toward the exit ramp. His movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, and he never stopped smiling that impossible smile. As he walked, he kept looking back at the mirror, maintaining eye contact with me across the barrier between reality and reflection. When he reached the point where the ramp curved out of sight, he stopped and raised both hands, gesturing for me to follow. The fog around my truck was growing denser, if such a thing were possible. My headlights, which had been managing to illuminate at least 20 feet ahead, were now barely penetrating 10 feet into the gray walls surrounding me, but the mirror's reflection remained crystal clear, showing the other Marcus waiting patiently at the curve of the exit ramp. The breathing mist. From Marcus Rodriguez. The thing about driving through Nevada at 3 in the morning is that you start to question what's real and what's just your mind playing tricks on you after 18 hours behind the wheel. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been hauling freight across the western states for the better part of 15 years. I've seen my share of strange things out there in the dark. Phantom hitchhikers, lights that follow you for miles. Towns that seem to appear and disappear like mirages. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Highway 50 that October night when the fog started growing teeth. I was running a load of electronics from Reno to Salt Lake City, making decent time despite the weight of my cargo. My Peterbilt 379 had been purring like a content cat all evening. the diesel engine maintaining that steady rhythm that becomes almost like a heartbeat after you've been on the road long enough. The radio was tuned to some late-night talk show discussing UFO sightings. The host's voice a comforting constant as I navigated the long, lonely stretches of asphalt that cut through the high desert. The fog started appearing around mile marker 127, just wisps at first, thin tendrils that danced across my headlight beams like ghostly fingers. Nothing unusual there. The desert gets cold at night, and when the temperature drops just right, moisture rises from the ground and creates these pockets of mist. I'd driven through hundreds of them over the years, but as I continued east, the fog began to thicken, rolling across the highway in waves that seemed almost purposeful in their movement. Within 20 minutes, what had started as scattered patches had become a solid wall of gray-white vapor that reduced my visibility to maybe 30 feet ahead of my bumper. I downshifted and slowed to about 40 miles per hour, my running lights cutting through the murk like amber knives. The fog had that peculiar quality of seeming to absorb sound. Even my engine noise became muffled, creating an eerie cocoon of silence around my cab. That's when I first noticed the breathing. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible over the hum of my diesel and the whisper of tires on asphalt. A rhythmic in and out sound, like something massive inhaling and exhaling just beyond the range of my headlights. I rolled down my window and listened more carefully, thinking maybe I had a leak in one of my air lines or a problem with my brake system. But the breathing wasn't coming from my truck. It was coming from the fog itself. The mist seemed to pulse with each breath, growing thicker on the inhale and thinning slightly as it exhaled. I could actually see the fog expanding and contracting around my truck like the walls of some enormous lung. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as an uncomfortable chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cool desert air flowing through my open window. I reached for my CB radio, hoping to reach another driver who might be experiencing the same thing, but all I got was static with an odd underlying sound, a wet sucking noise that made my skin crawl. I tried switching channels, but every frequency carried the same disturbing static. Even the AM/FM radio had gone dead, producing nothing but white noise punctuated by what sounded like distant chomping. As I continued through the fog bank, something began to change in the mist around me. What had started as smooth, undulating vapor began to develop texture. At first I thought it was just my imagination, my tired brain trying to make sense of the shapeless gray surrounding my truck. But as my headlights swept across the fog, I could swear I was seeing ridges and bumps, raised areas that looked almost organic in nature. The breathing grew louder, more pronounced, and with it came a new sound, a sort of wet, grinding noise, like something chewing. I slowed down even further, my speedometer dropping to 25 miles per hour as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The fog directly ahead of my truck began to part, creating a tunnel-like opening that seemed to beckon me forward. But as I approached, I realized the edges of this tunnel weren't smooth. They were lined with what looked like massive, yellowed teeth. Each tooth was easily the size of a traffic cone, curved and pointed like those of some prehistoric predator. They emerged from the fog itself, not attached to any visible jaw or creature, but growing directly from the mist as if it were solid flesh. The teeth glistened wetly in my headlight beams, and I could see thick strands of what looked like saliva connecting them. The grinding sound I'd been hearing was these teeth gnashing together, opening and closing the tunnel in a chewing motion that sent waves through the surrounding fog. My rational mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was just the way my headlights were hitting ice crystals in the fog, creating an optical illusion. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized and was hallucinating. But the sound was too real, too visceral to be explained away. The wet chomping of those massive teeth, the rhythmic breathing of the fog, the way the mist seemed to press against my truck like something alive and hungry. I brought my rig to a complete stop, engine idling as I tried to decide what to do. The tunnel of teeth stretched ahead of me, the only visible path through the fog bank. Behind me, the mist had closed in completely, eliminating any possibility of backing up. I was trapped in a pocket of relative visibility, surrounded on all sides by breathing fog that had grown a mouthful of nightmarish teeth. The chomping sound grew more aggressive, more insistent, and I realized the tunnel was beginning to close. The teeth were grinding together more rapidly, and the opening that had seemed like a passage was becoming smaller and smaller. Whatever this thing was, it was losing patience. I could feel my truck rocking slightly as currents of air moved through, the fog as if something enormous was shifting position around me. With no other choice, I pressed down on the accelerator and aimed straight for the center of the remaining opening. The moment I started moving forward, the fog seemed to react, the breathing becoming more excited, more rapid. The teeth began, snapping more violently. Trying to close the gap before I could pass through, I could hear them scraping against the top of my trailer with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, leaving gouges in the aluminum that I could feel through the truck's frame. As I pushed deeper into the tunnel, more teeth began to emerge from the walls of fog on either side of me. These were smaller but more numerous, creating a gauntlet of snapping jaws that reached for my truck, like grasping hands. Some managed to clamp down on my side mirrors, and I watched in horror as the glass shattered under the pressure of their bite. Others scraped along the sides of my trailer, leaving deep scratches and dents in the metal. The breathing was deafening now, a sound like wind rushing through a cavern, and with each exhale I could smell something putrid and organic, like the breath of some massive carnivore. My headlights illuminated more and more teeth emerging from the fog ahead. Not just lining the tunnel now, but filling it completely. A maze of gnashing, chomping obstacles that I had to navigate at increasingly dangerous speeds. I floored the accelerator, my diesel engine roaring as I pushed through the thickest part of the fog. Teeth scraped and snapped all around me, some managing to puncture my trailer walls with wet tearing sounds. The fog itself seemed to be trying to slow me down, becoming thicker and more viscous, like driving through syrup. My truck lurched and struggled against the resistance, but slowly, gradually, I began to see clear air ahead. The moment I broke free of the fog bank, everything stopped. The breathing, the chomping, the wet scraping sounds, all of it ceased immediately. I looked in my mirrors and saw nothing but normal-looking fog dissipating in the desert air behind. Me, no trace of the teeth or the tunnel or anything else I'd just experienced, if not for the damage to my truck. The shattered mirrors, the gouges in my trailer, the puncture holes that I could hear whistling in the wind. I might have convinced myself it had all been a hallucination. I drove for another 50 miles before I felt safe enough to pull over at a truck stop in Eerie. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot, I inspected the damage to my rig. The scratches and bite marks were real enough, too deep and too precisely shaped to be explained by road debris or low-hanging branches. Some of the puncture holes had a yellowish residue around their edges that I didn't want to touch or smell too closely. The other drivers at the truck stop looked at my damaged trailer with curiosity and concern, but when I tried to explain what had happened, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. One old-timer mentioned that stretch of Highway 50 had a reputation for strange incidents, especially on foggy nights, but even he seemed dubious when I described the teeth. Voices from Tomorrow's Road, from Jake Martinez. The CB crackled to life somewhere between Amarillo and nothing, static washing over the cabin of my Peterbilt like digital rain. I'd been hauling freight for 12 years, and the radio chatter usually followed the same predictable rhythm. Truckers sharing weather reports, speed trap warnings, and the occasional lonely soul looking for someone to talk through the long night hours. But as I adjusted the squelch control with one weathered finger, what came through the speaker made me ease off the throttle just a fraction. Breaker 19. This is Ghost Rider eastbound on I-40, mile marker 287. Got a situation here, folks. Roads completely washed out about 15 miles ahead. Bridge over Palo Duro Creek is gone. I repeat, do not attempt to cross at mile marker 302. I glanced at my GPS display, the blue glow casting shadows across my face in the pre-dawn darkness. According to the screen, I was approaching mile marker 285. The bridge at 302 was exactly where I needed to cross to make my delivery in Oklahoma City on time. Rain had been falling steadily for the past hour, turning the world beyond my windshield into a blur of streaking water and reflected headlight beams, so a washout wasn't entirely unreasonable. But something about the voice bothered me. Not the message itself, but the quality of the transmission. It was too clear, too crisp, cutting through the static like a blade through silk. "Thanks for the heads up, Ghost Rider," I responded, keying the microphone. "This is Desert Fox, westbound." "Wait, did you say eastbound?" "I'm running eastbound on 40. Silence answered me, broken only by the steady rhythm of my wipers and the low growl of the diesel engine. The CB hissed softly, and I could hear my own breathing echo in the cab. Outside, the Texas Panhandle stretched away into darkness, marked only by the occasional ranch light burning like a lonely star in the vast emptiness. Then the radio crackled again, and the same voice returned. But this time there was an urgency that made my spine straighten against the driver's seat. "All eastbound traffic, this is Ghost Rider. Do not, I repeat, do not stop at the Flying J at mile marker 311. There's been an incident. Multiple casualties. State police have the entire area cordoned off." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The Flying J at mile marker 311 was exactly where I'd planned to fuel up and grab a cup of coffee to push through to Oklahoma City. I'd stopped there dozens of times over the years. Knew the layout by heart. 6 diesel pumps, a well-stocked convenience store, and Dottie behind the counter, who always asked about my wife Maria back in Phoenix. The idea of multiple casualties at that familiar, comfortable truck stop sent a chill crawling up my arms like cold fingers. I reached for the CB microphone again. "Ghost Rider, this is Desert Fox. What kind of incident are we talking about? Should I contact authorities?" The response came immediately, but now I could hear something in the background of the transmission. A sound like wind, but not quite wind. More like the whisper of voices at the very edge of perception. "Desert Fox, negative on contacting authorities. They're already aware. Just find another route, brother. Trust me on this one." I eased the Peterbilt down to 65, my mind racing through alternatives. The next fuel stop would be another 40 miles, and I was already running lower on diesel than I preferred. But the conviction in Ghost Rider's voice was absolute, and after 12 years of long-haul trucking, you learn to trust the instincts of fellow drivers. We looked out for each other on these endless stretches of asphalt and darkness. 20 minutes passed in relative quiet. Just the steady drum of rain against the windshield and the hypnotic sweep of the wipers. Then, as I approached mile marker 300, the CB erupted with activity. Multiple voices overlapped in a cacophony of urgent transmissions. Fire departments still trying to contain the blaze. Heard it was a chemical spill from that tanker that jackknifed. 3 trucks involved, maybe 4. Ought to route around through Childress, but that'll add 2 hours easy. I tried to break into the chatter, but the voices continued without acknowledging my attempts to communicate. Gradually, though, I began to notice something deeply unsettling about the conversations. The drivers were discussing the incident at the Flying J with an intimacy and detail that suggested they were eyewitnesses. But they were also sharing information about road conditions, weather patterns, and construction delays that contradicted everything I could see through my windshield. One voice mentioned heavy snow making the highway treacherous, but I was driving through a warm September rain. Another warned about construction delays that wouldn't begin until next spring, according to the Department of Transportation notices I'd received a week ago. Most disturbing of all, several drivers referenced GPS coordinates and mile markers that didn't match the geography I'd traveled this route through for over a decade. As I crested a low hill, the lights of the Flying J truck stop spread out before me in the distance, exactly where they should be at mile marker 311. But instead of the cordoned-off disaster scene Ghost Rider had described, I could see trucks moving in and out of the parking areas, the familiar glow of the convenience store windows, and the bright illumination of the fuel islands. Everything appeared completely normal. I downshifted as I approached the exit ramp, torn between the urgent warnings crackling through my CB and the evidence of my own eyes. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining, and the next truck stop would push me dangerously close to running dry. But Ghost Rider's voice had carried such conviction, such genuine concern, that I found myself reluctant to ignore the warning. The CB crackled again, and this time I heard my own voice coming through the speaker. But it wasn't what I was saying at that moment. It was a conversation I distinctly remembered having 3 hours earlier with a driver headed toward Albuquerque. Word for word, inflection for inflection, it was perfect reproduction of an exchange that had already taken place. Yet according to the timestamp on my dashboard clock, it was happening now. My hands began to tremble slightly as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I grabbed the microphone and spoke carefully into it. Breaker 19, this is Desert Fox. Is anyone else hearing these repeated transmissions? The response that came back was my own voice again, asking the exact same question I'd just asked, but with a slight delay that made it sound like an echo bouncing back from some distant canyon wall. Then another voice joined in, also mine, but asking about road conditions near Tucumcari that I'd inquired about 6 hours ago when I'd first started this run. I was listening to my own CB transmissions from the past, somehow bleeding through into the present moment. But that wasn't the most terrifying realization creeping over me like ice water in my veins. If the radio was picking up conversations from the past, then Ghost Rider's warnings about the bridge washout and the Flying J incident might be transmissions from the future. Events that hadn't happened yet but would. The exit ramp for the Flying J passed by my passenger window as I maintained speed on the interstate, choosing to trust the impossible warning rather than my physical senses. In the rearview mirror, I watched the truck stop's lights fade into the rainy darkness and tried to convince myself I'd made the right choice. The fuel gauge stared back at me like an accusing eye, but I pressed forward toward the next available stop. 43 miles later, I pulled into a smaller truck stop I'd never noticed before. Despite traveling this route monthly for years, the place had an odd, timeless quality. Not quite modern, but not exactly dated either. The diesel pumps accepted my fleet card without issue, and as I filled up, I could hear other drivers talking about the major pileup at the Flying J, how a chemical tanker had jackknifed in the rain and taken out 3 other trucks, closing the facility for hours. Back in my cab, I tried the CB again, hoping for some explanation or at least confirmation that other drivers were experiencing the same temporal displacement in their radio communications, but the airwaves had gone completely silent. Not even the usual static that provided constant background noise. The radio worked. I could hear the hiss when I opened the channel, but it was as if every truck on I-40 had simultaneously turned off their CBs. As I merged back onto the interstate, now running about an hour behind schedule but with a full tank and a growing sense of unease, the radio finally spoke again. Ghost Rider's voice came through with that same impossible clarity, but now I could hear something else underneath it, a quality that made my skin crawl with recognition. Desert Fox, this is Ghost Rider. You made the right choice back there. The bridge at mile marker 302 washed out. The endless circuit. From Marcus Chen. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you stop seeing it. You know what I mean? Interstate 47 through the Nevada desert becomes just a ribbon of asphalt and memory. Mile markers counting down like a metronome in your peripheral vision. My Peterbilt 389 had made this run from Reno to Vegas more times than I could count, hauling everything from construction equipment to casino supplies, the diesel engine's steady rumble becoming the soundtrack to my life. That Tuesday night started like any other. Rain was coming down in sheets across the windshield, unusual for this stretch of desert but not unheard of. The wipers carved temporary crescents of clarity through the water, their rhythmic sweep hypnotic in the darkness. I'd left Reno around 10 p.m. with a load of slot machines bound for a new casino development outside Las Vegas, the trailer heavy and stable behind me. The CB radio crackled with the occasional trucker checking in, but mostly it was just me and the road, the way I liked it. The first sign something was different came around midnight, somewhere between Fallon and Hawthorne. I knew this stretch like the back of my hand. A long, straight shot through scrubland with maybe 3 or 4 exits over 60 miles. But as I crested a small hill, I saw lights ahead that shouldn't have been there. Not the harsh white of oncoming headlights or the amber glow of a truck stop, but something softer, almost dreamlike. Neon signs flickered in the distance, their colors bleeding through the rain like watercolors on wet paper. I downshifted, the Jake brake rumbling as I approached what appeared to be a small town. But that was impossible. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, and there was nothing out here except sagebrush and the occasional abandoned gas station. Yet here it was, stretching along both sides of the highway, a collection of diners, motels, and service stations that glowed with an ethereal light. The neon signs read familiar names: Mom's Diner, Desert Rose Motel, Last Chance Gas. But their fonts seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, like heat mirages in reverse. I pulled into the truck stop, telling myself I needed fuel even though my tanks were 3/4 full. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few other big rigs, their drivers nowhere to be seen. The rain had stopped, I realized, though I couldn't remember when. The silence was profound, broken only by the settling sounds of my cooling engine and the gentle buzz of neon transformers above. Inside the truck stop, everything felt slightly off-kilter. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that seemed to resonate in my chest, and the aisles stretched a little too far, stocked with brands I almost recognized but not quite. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who smiled when she saw me. But when I tried to focus on her face, the details seemed to blur together like a photograph taken through water. "Evening, honey," she said, her voice carrying the warm cadence of every truck stop clerk I'd ever met. "Nasty night for driving. Coffee's fresh and we've got hot food if you're interested." I thanked her and grabbed a cup of coffee, noting that it tasted exactly like every truck stop coffee I'd ever had, yet somehow more so, as if someone had distilled the essence of late-night caffeine and loneliness into liquid form. Back in my truck, I pulled out my logbook and tried to mark my location, but the words seemed to resist being written. The pen felt heavy in my hand, and the page appeared to blur whenever I looked directly at it. I shook my head, attributing it to fatigue, and fired up the Peterbilt. The engine caught with its familiar rumble, and I pulled back onto the highway, watching the strange town recede in my mirrors until it was swallowed by the darkness. But 20 minutes later, I crested the same hill and saw the same lights ahead. My heart rate picked up as I approached the identical collection of buildings, the same neon signs flickering in the same sequence. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only a blank blue field with a single white dot representing my truck, floating in digital nowhere. The radio crackled with static, occasionally resolving into fragments of conversations that seemed to come from decades past, references to loads and routes that hadn't existed since the 70s. This time, I didn't stop. I kept the hammer down and pushed through the town, watching my speedometer hold steady at 65 while the buildings crawled past like I was moving through thick honey. In my side mirrors, I could see other truckers in the parking lot, but they stood too still, their faces turned up toward the sky as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The neon reflections on my wet windshield painted shifting patterns of color that seemed to spell out words in languages I didn't recognize. When I cleared the town limits, I pushed the Peterbilt harder, the turbo whistling as I climbed toward 80 miles per hour. The desert flew past in a blur of darkness, sagebrush and occasional road signs that flickered by too quickly to read. But my heart sank as the familiar hill appeared ahead once more, and beyond it, the impossible lights of the town that shouldn't exist. The third time through, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. The same cars were parked in the same spaces at the diner, their chrome bumpers reflecting the neon in identical patterns. A man in a cowboy hat stood beside a 1970s Kenworth, his arm raised in the same wave he'd given me the previous 2 times. The woman at the gas pump wore a sundress despite the cool night air, and she turned to watch me pass with the same slight smile and curious tilt of her head. I grabbed my CB microphone with a shaking hand. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Marcus on Interstate 47. Any drivers out there copy? Static filled the cab, but then a voice emerged from the white noise, distant and hollow like it was being transmitted from the bottom of a well. We copy you, eastbound Marcus. Welcome to the circuit. The voice could have belonged to anyone, man or woman, young or old. It simply was. How many times through now? 3, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. What is this place? Same place it's always been, came the reply. Same place it'll always be. Some roads don't lead anywhere, Marcus. Some roads just lead back to themselves. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the speedometer needle barely moved. The town approached with the same dreamlike slowness, and I found myself studying the faces of the people I passed. They looked content, these phantom travelers, like they'd found something in this endless loop that satisfied them. A part of me that I didn't want to acknowledge felt the pull of that contentment, the appeal of never having to worry about deadlines or destinations again. The 4th pass revealed that one of the trucks in the parking lot was identical to mine. Same model, same paint job, even the same company logos on the doors. Through the windshield, I could see a figure that might have been me, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, face turned upward in that same listening pose as the others. The sight sent adrenaline coursing through my system, and I fought against the dreamy lassitude that had been settling over me. I tried everything I could think of. I turned off at every exit, but they all curved back to the main highway. I pulled off into the desert, but the dirt roads inevitably led to on-ramps that merged back into the same stretch of Interstate 47. I drove backward, but somehow still ended up approaching the town from the same direction. Time had become elastic. My watch showed different hours each time I checked it, and the position of the moon in the sky seemed to shift randomly. On what I counted as the 7th loop, I noticed that my fuel gauge hadn't moved despite hours of driving. The coffee I'd bought at the truck stop remained at the same temperature, never growing cold despite sitting in my cup holder for what felt like days. My CB radio continued to crackle with voices of other drivers, some resigned, some panicked, all trapped in their own versions of the circuit. The trick, came a new voice over the radio, calm and measured, is not to fight it. The road wants to keep you, son. The more you struggle, the tighter it holds on. Who is this? I asked, but the voice was already fading into static. The breakthrough came on the 10th pass, or maybe the 15th. I'd lost count. As I approached the town, I noticed something different about the neon signs. They weren't quite synchronized anymore. The Desert Rose Motel's sign flickered a half-second behind the others, like a film reel slipping out of sync. I focused on that imperfection, that tiny flaw in the dream logic that held this place together. The Collector's Due, from Marcus Chen. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the October moon, and my Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I approached the toll booth that shouldn't have been there. I'd driven this route between Sacramento and Reno probably 300 times over the past decade, hauling everything from produce to electronics across the Sierra Nevada foothills. And I knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every construction zone by heart. But this toll booth, sitting alone under a pool of sickly yellow light, was something entirely new. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 in the morning, and a light drizzle had started to mist my windshield about an hour back. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers created a hypnotic pattern against the glass, and I'd been fighting drowsiness for the better part of 50 miles. Maybe that explained why I hadn't noticed the overhead signs announcing the toll plaza until I was already committed to the right lane, my 18-wheeler's momentum carrying me inexorably toward the collection booth. The structure looked old, far older than anything the Department of Transportation would have approved for a modern highway. The booth itself appeared to be constructed of weathered wood rather than the standard metal and glass, and the overhead canopy sagged in the middle as if bearing an invisible weight. A single fluorescent tube flickered sporadically inside the booth, casting erratic shadows that seemed to writhe and dance behind the grimy windows. As I downshifted and began applying the air brakes, the familiar hiss and wheeze of the system seemed muffled by the strange atmosphere surrounding this place. The usual highway sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the whistle of wind through the cab's weather stripping, all of it felt dampened and distant. Even my CB radio, which had been crackling with occasional chatter from other night haulers, had fallen completely silent. I rolled down my window as I approached the booth, expecting to see a bored toll collector reaching out with an electronic scanner, or waiting for exact change. Instead, the booth appeared to be completely empty. The flickering fluorescent light illuminated a small interior that looked like it hadn't been occupied in years. A wooden stool sat behind the counter, and scattered papers covered the surface, but there was no sign of any human presence. The booth had clearly seen better days. Paint peeled from its wooden frame in long, curling strips, and the windows were so clouded with grime that it was difficult to see through them clearly. A small placard mounted on the side of the structure displayed a rate schedule, but the numbers seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them directly. The only clear text I could make out was a sign that read, "Exact change only," in faded red letters. I sat there for several long moments, my engine idling, waiting for someone to appear or for some indication of what I was supposed to do. The rain continued to patter against my windshield, and the toll booth's overhead lights created an island of visibility in the surrounding darkness. Beyond the reach of those lights, the highway seemed to vanish entirely, as if the world simply ceased to exist past this point. A metallic scraping sound drew my attention back to the booth. A small metal tray had extended from a slot in the counter, the kind you might see at a bank drive-through. The tray swayed slightly in the night breeze, and I noticed that it contained what appeared to be a handwritten note. The paper looked ancient, yellowed and brittle, but the ink seemed fresh and dark. I reached out from my cab window and carefully retrieved the note. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, as if written by someone with trembling hands. It read, "Payment required for passage. Standard rate applies to commercial vehicles. Please deposit exact change and proceed when gate opens." Looking ahead, I could indeed see a gate arm blocking my path, painted in alternating yellow and black stripes that seemed to pulse and move in the flickering light. The gate was clearly down, and there was no way my rig could continue without paying whatever toll was required. The problem was I still had no idea what that amount might be. I glanced back at the rate schedule on the side of the booth, and this time the numbers seemed to hold steady long enough for me to read them. Commercial vehicles, according to the faded display, were charged $15 for passage. It seemed reasonable enough, certainly less than many of the tolls I encountered on the East Coast runs. I reached for my wallet and extracted 3 $5 bills, then placed them carefully in the metal tray. The tray retracted into the booth with the same metallic scraping sound, and I waited for the gate to rise. Instead, the tray immediately extended again, and my money was still there, accompanied by another note. This one read, "Exact change only. Please deposit correct amount in coin." $15 in exact change was going to be a challenge. I kept some quarters and dollar coins in my ashtray for vending machines and parking meters, but I doubted I had that much in small denominations. I began counting out what coins I had, stacking quarters and dollar coins on my passenger seat. The total came to $8.75, well short of what I needed. As I sat there trying to figure out my next move, I became aware of a sound coming from inside the toll booth. It was faint at first, barely audible over my idling engine, but gradually grew more distinct. Someone was speaking, though I couldn't make out the words. The voice was thin and reedy, with the quality of old paper rustling in the wind. I turned off my engine, hoping to hear more clearly. The sudden silence felt oppressive, broken only by the gentle ticking of cooling metal and the soft patter of rain. The voice from the booth became more audible, though the words still seemed to slip away whenever I tried to focus on them. It sounded like someone counting, repeating numbers in a patient, methodical rhythm. The booth's interior had grown brighter, though the fluorescent tube continued its erratic flickering. Through the grimy windows, I could now make out a shadowy figure seated on the wooden stool. The figure appeared to be bent over the counter, working with papers or cards, occasionally reaching toward what looked like an old-fashioned cash register. I called out toward the booth. "Excuse me, I don't have exact change. Is there somewhere I can break a 20? The counting stopped immediately, and the figure in the booth became perfectly still. After a long moment, the metallic tray extended again, this time carrying a different note. The handwriting was the same, but the message was more urgent. Exact change is required. Payment must be made in coin. No exceptions. A growing sense of unease began to settle in my chest like cold fog. This entire situation felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The toll booth that appeared from nowhere, the archaic payment system, the mysterious figure who communicated only through handwritten notes, all of it seemed like something from a different era entirely. I wondered if I might have taken a wrong exit somewhere, ended up on an old highway that had been bypassed by the modern interstate system. I tried starting my CB radio again, hoping to raise another trucker who might know where I was, but the unit produced only static and occasional electronic squeaks. My cell phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't unusual in this remote area, but even the GPS seemed confused, displaying only a blank screen where the map should have been. The figure in the booth had resumed its counting, and I noticed that other sounds were beginning to emerge from the darkness around me. Distant engines, the hiss of air brakes, the rumble of heavy tires on asphalt. Other vehicles were approaching, though I couldn't see any headlights in my mirrors. I made a decision and climbed down from my cab, thinking I might be able to speak directly to whoever was in the booth and work out some arrangement for payment. The asphalt beneath my feet felt strange, softer than it should have been, and my footsteps made no sound as I walked toward the collection window. Up close, the booth looked even more decrepit than it had from my truck. The wood was rotted in places, and I could smell the musty odor of decay and dampness. The figure inside was clearer now, though still indistinct, like someone viewed through heavy fog. It appeared to be an elderly man wearing what looked like a uniform from decades past, complete with a peaked cap and brass buttons. I knocked gently on the window frame and called out, "Sir, I'm having trouble with the exact change requirement. Is there any way we can work something out?" The figure looked up from his counting, and I caught just a glimpse of his face before he turned back to his work. What I saw made my blood run cold. His features were there, but somehow insubstantial, like a photograph that had been overexposed until only the faintest outlines remained. His eyes were dark hollows, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Exact change only," he repeated, each word carefully enunciated. $15 in coins. Static between worlds. From Marcus. The 18-wheeler's cabin felt smaller than usual as I guided her down Interstate 70 through the heart of Colorado, the Rocky Mountains looming like sleeping giants against a star-drunk sky. It was 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world seems to hold its breath, and I'd been fighting sleep for the last 50 miles. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, leaving me with nothing but the steady thrum of the diesel engine and the occasional sweep of headlights from the rare car passing in the opposite direction. I reached for the radio dial, hoping to find something to keep my mind sharp for the next 100 miles to Denver. The airwaves up here in the mountains were always tricky, catching fragments of distant stations that faded in and out like ghosts. I spun through the usual suspects. Classic rock from Colorado Springs cutting in and out with bursts of static, A talk show host's voice warbling through atmospheric interference. A Spanish language station that came through crystal clear for 30 seconds before dissolving into white noise. Then I found something different. The signal came in clean and strong, cleaner than it had any right to be in these mountains. A smooth jazz saxophone was playing, the kind of sultry midnight sound that belonged in a dimly lit club rather than drifting through a truck cab on a desolate highway. But it wasn't the music that caught my attention. It was the quality of the broadcast itself. The sound was pristine, like listening to a live performance through expensive headphones. Every note crisp and perfectly balanced. I glanced at the radio display, expecting to see a call sign or frequency number, but the little LED screen showed only a series of dashes where the station identification should have been. That was strange, but not unheard of in mountainous terrain where signals could bounce off peaks and valleys in unusual ways. I left it tuned in, grateful for the company of that smooth saxophone as the highway curved through another mountain pass. The music played for maybe 20 minutes, transitioning seamlessly from one piece to another, without any DJ interruption or commercial breaks. Just pure, uninterrupted jazz that seemed to match the rhythm of my truck's engine, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere in the cabin. The mountains rolled past my windows like a slow-motion movie, their peaks touched with silver moonlight. And for the first time in hours, I felt genuinely relaxed. Then came the voice. "Good evening, night traveler," said a man with the kind of deep, resonant tone that belonged to the golden age of radio. His voice had that warm, intimate quality that made you feel like he was speaking directly to you, like you were old friends sharing a quiet conversation. "This is Eddie Marlowe coming to you from somewhere between here and there, bringing you the finest sounds for your midnight journeys." I smiled despite myself. Eddie Marlowe. Even the name sounded like it belonged to another era, when radio DJs were personalities rather than just voices reading from corporate playlists. His voice faded out and the music resumed, a slow blues number that seemed to capture the loneliness of long-haul driving better than any song I'd ever heard. But as I listened more carefully, something began to feel off. The music was beautiful, professionally recorded, but there was an odd quality to it, like it was being played from very old recordings. Not just old, ancient. The sound had that slightly compressed, atmospheric quality of music from the 1940s or 1950s, yet it was coming through with a digital clarity that seemed impossible for recordings of that vintage. Eddie's voice returned between songs, always warm and conversational, always speaking as if he knew his audience personally. "That was Midnight on the Highway by the Tommy Morrison Quartet," he said after one particularly haunting piece. "Goes out to all you road warriors out there, keeping America moving through the small hours. I know it gets lonely out there in the dark, but remember, you're never truly alone. Someone's always listening." The way he said that last part sent a small chill down my spine, though I couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, the way the mountains seemed to swallow up my truck's headlight beams, making the world feel infinite and empty at the same time. I reached for my CB radio to see if any other drivers were picking up the same signal, but the CB crackled with nothing but static and the occasional faint voice too distant to understand. As the night wore on, Eddie's show began to feel more and more surreal. He played music I'd never heard but somehow felt familiar with, as if the melodies had been buried deep in my memory and were only now surfacing. He told stories between songs, rambling tales about life on the road, about drivers he'd known over the years, about the strange things that happened in the dark hours when the rest of the world was sleeping. I remember talking to a driver named Big Jim Murphy back in '73, Eddie said during one of his monologues. Jim was hauling steel through the Pennsylvania mountains when he picked up our signal. Called in on the request line. Oh yes, friends, we used to take calls back in the day. And Jim told me he'd been driving for 30 years but had never heard music like ours. Said it sounded like it was coming from another world entirely. The mention of a request line intrigued me. and I found myself scanning the radio for any indication of a phone number, but Eddie never mentioned one. Just continued his easy patter about drivers and roads and the music that connected them all. His stories began to blend together, forming a dreamlike narrative about the hidden community of night drivers, the brotherhood of those who navigated America's highways while everyone else slept. Then, around 4 a.m, things took a decidedly strange turn. "We've got a special dedication tonight," Eddie announced, his voice carrying a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Excitement, maybe, or anticipation. "This one goes out to Marcus, driving eastbound on I-70 in that beautiful Kenworth. Marcus, I know you're out there listening, and I want you to know how much we appreciate you tuning in tonight. This is Highway Crossing by the Phantom 5, and it's just for you." My hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard I heard the leather creak. He'd said my name, my actual name, and he'd known I was driving eastbound on I-70. Hell, he'd even identified my truck model correctly. I grabbed my CB radio mic, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Breaker 19, this is Diesel Marcus," I called out, my voice tight with confusion. "Anyone else out there picking up this jazz station?" DJ just called me out by name. "Anyone copy?" Static answered me. The kind of deep, empty static that suggested I was truly alone on this stretch of highway. I tried again, adjusting my CB's squelch and scanning through different channels, but found nothing except the occasional burst of interference from some far-off conversation. Back on the mystery station, the music played on, a haunting instrumental that seemed to echo the sound of wind through mountain passes. But now I was listening with different ears, paying attention to details I'd missed before. The music never quite sounded contemporary, even when it shifted to more modern styles. There was always that underlying quality of age, as if every song was being played from recordings that were decades old. And Eddie's voice, now that I was really focusing on it, had an odd quality too. Not just the old-fashioned radio announcer style, but something deeper. A slight echo, perhaps, or the kind of subtle distortion you might get from playing back very old magnetic tape. "Marcus," Eddie said, and this time there was no mistaking that he was speaking directly to me. "I can see you're getting a little spooked out there. That's natural, friend. The night does things to a man's mind, especially when he's been driving as long as you have tonight. But there's nothing to fear here. We're just music lovers, bringing a little companionship to the lonely hours." I hadn't picked up my CB again, hadn't made any other attempt to communicate, but somehow he'd known about my growing unease. My mouth went dry and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, though for what I couldn't say. The highway stretched empty behind me, just as empty as it was ahead. Nothing but my truck and the endless mountain darkness. "Tell me, Marcus," Eddie continued, his voice taking on a more conversational tone. "What do you think happens to radio shows when they end? Do they just disappear into the ether? Or do they find their way to some other place some other time? It's a question that's always fascinated me." The music that followed was different from what had come before. Slower, more ethereal, with an underlying current of something that might have been sadness or might have been longing. As it played, I began to notice other details about the broadcast that I'd overlooked. There were no weather reports, no traffic updates, none of the usual information that nighttime radio typically provided for drivers. No commercials, no station identifications, no mentions of current events or contemporary culture. The town that dreams in glass, from Marcus Chen. The windshield wipers beat a hypnotic rhythm against the steady drizzle as I guided my Peterbilt down Highway 34, the yellow center line disappearing into the mist ahead like a thread leading into darkness. 3 decades of hauling freight across these forgotten stretches of America had taught me to read the road like scripture. But tonight the familiar verses seemed written in a language I no longer recognized. The GPS had lost signal 40 miles back, leaving me with nothing but instinct and the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the October fog. That's when I first saw the sign, weathered and leaning at an angle that suggested years of neglect. Millfield, population 847, drive safe. The metal surface caught my headlights for just a moment. and I could have sworn I saw words shifting beneath the paint, rearranging themselves like sediment in disturbed water. But when I blinked and looked again, it was just an ordinary town marker, the kind you'd find at the edge of any small community that time had forgotten. The engine's steady rumble seemed to quiet as I rolled into Millfield's main drag, though my tachometer showed no change in RPMs. Street lamps cast pools of amber light every 50 feet, but between them lay patches of darkness so complete they seemed to swallow sound itself. The businesses lining the street were the usual suspects you'd expect in a town this size. A diner with a flickering neon sign that read, Mel's. A gas station with pumps old enough to remember when fuel cost under $1. And a motel that had probably seen better days during the Eisenhower administration. What struck me as odd wasn't what I saw, but what I didn't see. No parked cars lined the curbs. No porch lights glowed in the residential windows visible down the side streets. No traffic lights governed intersections that clearly needed them. It was as if the entire town had simply paused, holding its breath until some unseen signal gave it permission to resume living. I pulled into the gas station, my air brakes hissing like a tired sigh. The fuel gauge showed I had enough diesel to reach my destination, but something about this place made me want to top off the tank to ensure I could leave whenever I chose. The pump was one of those ancient mechanical models that displayed gallons and price with spinning numbers behind scratched plexiglass, and when I tried to pay with my card, the reader just stared back at me with a blank screen. Through the station's windows, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered over empty aisles of convenience store staples. A bell chimed when I pushed through the door, but no one emerged from the back office to greet me. The coffee maker gurgled with what looked like a fresh pot, steam still rising from the glass carafe. But dust covered the candy bars and the milk in the cooler had an expiration date from 2 weeks ago. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls lined with motor oil and windshield washer fluid. "Anyone here?" The only answer came from outside where the wind had picked up, whistling through the gap beneath the door with a sound like distant voices. I left a 20 on the counter for the gas and retreated to my truck. But as I climbed into the cab, I noticed something that made my skin prickle with unease. Every vehicle I'd passed on the street, every car and every driveway visible from my vantage point had been wiped clean except for their windshields. The glass surfaces were covered in what looked like condensation, but the droplets formed patterns that resembled letters, words, entire sentences written in a script that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I started the engine and pulled back onto the main street, telling myself it was just humidity, just the normal condensation that forms on glass when the temperature drops. But as I drove deeper into town, I began to notice that the patterns on each windshield were different, unique as fingerprints, and they all seemed to be spelling out messages I couldn't quite read. The houses grew sparser as I approached what I assumed was the far end of Millfield, but instead of finding the edge of town and the return of Highway 34, the road curved gently to the left, then to the right, leading me in a wide arc that brought me back to the same gas station where I'd stopped before. The $20 bill still sat on the counter inside, visible through the window, but now there were other bills beside it. 10s and 20s and 5s scattered across the surface like leaves blown by an autumn wind. I tried a different route, turning right at what I thought was the first major intersection. The street led past a school where playground equipment stood motionless in the misty air, past a small library with books visible through darkened windows, past a church whose steeple disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. But 15 minutes later, I was looking at that same gas station again, that same pile of money growing larger on the counter. The fuel gauge hadn't moved. According to the odometer, I'd driven nearly 30 miles through a town that couldn't have been more than a few blocks across, but I hadn't used an ounce of diesel. Time seemed different here, too. My dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., the same time it had shown when I first entered Millfield over an hour ago. That's when I began to notice the sounds coming from outside the truck. Soft voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all talking at once in whispers so quiet I had to strain to hear individual words. They seemed to be coming from the windshields of every parked car, every stopped vehicle, as if the glass itself had learned to speak. I rolled my window down and listened, my heart rate climbing as the whispers grew more distinct. They were telling stories, I realized. Stories about the road, about journeys that never ended, about travelers who had stopped for gas or food or rest and found themselves unable to leave. The voices spoke of highways that led in circles, of towns that existed between 1 mile marker and the next, of windshields that showed not the road ahead but the reflections of other times, other places, other drivers who had passed this way and never passed through. One voice rose above the others, clearer and more insistent. It was coming from the windshield of a sedan parked directly in front of my truck, and as I watched, the condensation on the glass began to form words I could actually read. Welcome to Millfield. Population 848, drive safe. The number had changed. Where the sign at the town's edge had proclaimed 847 residents, this new census count had increased by 1. I looked at my own windshield and saw my breath hadn't fogged the glass despite the chill, but something else was writing itself across the surface in droplets that seemed to well up from within the glass itself. Marcus Chen. The words read, Driver, Peterbilt lost. Below that, more words appeared. Story begins here. I gunned the engine and careened down the main street, taking corners at speeds that should have jackknifed the trailer but somehow didn't. The town blurred past in streaks of streetlight and shadow, but no matter which direction I chose, no matter how fast I drove, every road led back to that same intersection, that same gas station, that same growing pile of money left behind by other travelers who had stopped to fuel up and stayed forever. The whispers from the windshields grew louder as I drove, telling me about the others who had joined Millfield's population. Truck drivers like me, families on vacation, teenagers heading home from late dates, salesmen working territories that no longer existed, all of them trying to leave, all of them discovering that some towns don't appear on maps because they exist in the spaces between destinations, feeding on the stories of those who stumble into their boundaries. But then I remembered something my grandfather had told me when I first started driving trucks. He'd spoken about places like this, towns that existed only at night, only in the fog, only when travelers were tired enough and lonely enough to need them. He'd said the secret wasn't to fight the town's pull, but to give it what it wanted before it could claim you completely. I pulled over at the side of the road and climbed out of the cab, approaching the nearest car with its message-covered windshield. The whispers grew excited as I drew near, dozens of voices overlapping in anticipation, but instead of trying to read what they were writing, instead of listening to their stories, I began to tell my own. I talked about the highways I'd traveled, the cities I'd seen, the sunrises that had painted the sky in colors that had no names. I spoke about truck stops where the coffee was always too strong and the pie was always too sweet. About radio voices that kept me company through the long stretches between nowhere and somewhere else. I told them about my family, about the home I was trying to reach, about the life that waited for me beyond their whispered promises of eternal stories and endless roads. The Corrosion Highway, from Marcus Webb. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the October moon, endless asphalt disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights. My Peterbilt 379 hummed its familiar tune, that deep diesel purr that had been my companion for the past 15 years of long-haul trucking. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter, but mostly it was just me, my rig, and the hypnotic rhythm of mile markers flashing past at 70 miles per hour. I'd been hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Phoenix, a routine run I'd made dozens of times before. The load was secure, my logbook current, and I had enough drive time to make good progress through the night. The weather had been clear when I left Michigan, but somewhere around the Colorado border, a strange fog had begun to roll in from the east, thick and yellowish, carrying an odd metallic smell that seemed to seep through my air vents despite having them closed. The first sign something wasn't right came when I noticed the other trucks. In 15 years of driving, you develop an instinct about your fellow drivers, a sense of the unspoken brotherhood that exists between those of us who live our lives between the white lines. But tonight, the few rigs I encountered were behaving strangely. They kept their distance further back than normal courtesy would suggest, and when I tried to raise them on the CB, I got nothing but static and what sounded like urgent whispers in languages I couldn't identify. My fuel gauge showed I had enough diesel to reach the next major truck stop, but the warning light for my DEF fluid had been glowing amber for the past 50 miles. Diesel exhaust fluid wasn't something you could ignore for too long without risking expensive engine problems, so when I saw the glow of what appeared to be a service station emerging from the fog ahead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The station looked older than most, with those rounded canopy edges that spoke of construction from decades past. Neon signs flickered weakly in the mist, casting everything in an unsettling pink and blue glow that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The place appeared deserted except for a single attendant visible through the grimy windows of the service building, hunched over what might have been paperwork or a magazine, his face obscured by shadows. I pulled my rig alongside the diesel pumps, noting how the metal nozzles and handles seemed to have an unusual patina, as if they'd aged decades in mere years. The concrete beneath my tires was stained in patterns I'd never seen before, circular marks that radiated outward like ripples in a pond, but these ripples were etched permanently into the pavement itself. The air outside my cab hit me like a physical presence when I opened the door. That metallic smell was stronger here, accompanied by something else, something organic and wrong that made my throat constrict involuntarily. The fog swirled around my ankles as I walked toward the service building, and I noticed how it seemed to cling to every metal surface, the pump handles, the light fixtures, even the chrome bumpers of my own truck. The attendant looked up as I approached, and I saw that his face was younger than his posture had suggested, but there was something ancient in his eyes, a weariness that spoke of having seen too much. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach those tired eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same metallic quality as the air around us. "Evening, driver. What can I do for you?" His words seemed to echo slightly, as if the fog itself was carrying them back to me a fraction of a second after he spoke them. "Need to top off my DEF tank," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing unease that was settling in my chest like cold lead. "And maybe grab some coffee if you've got any." He nodded slowly, too slowly, as if the motion took considerable effort. "DEF's around back with the other specialty fluids. Help yourself. Coffee's fresh. Just made it an hour ago." He gestured toward a corner of the station where a coffee pot sat under flickering fluorescent lights, the liquid inside looking thick and dark as motor oil. I made my way around the building, following painted arrows on the concrete that seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision, always pointing the way forward, but never quite where I remembered them being when I looked directly. The DEF pump was there, newer than the rest of the equipment and gleaming despite the fog that seemed to dull everything else. As I began filling my tank, I noticed the strangest thing. Where droplets of the fluid had spilled onto the concrete, small holes were appearing, perfectly round and smooth as if the liquid had simply dissolved the stone. But DEF was basically urea and water. Nothing that should cause that kind of reaction. I knelt down for a closer look and saw that the holes didn't stop at the surface. They continued down into the concrete, creating perfect cylindrical voids that seemed to go deeper than should have been possible. The smell was getting stronger now, that metallic tang mixed with something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit. I looked back toward my truck and felt my heart skip a beat. The chrome exhaust stacks were beginning to show dark spots, small at first but growing larger as I watched. The spots weren't rust, they were holes, as if the metal itself was being eaten away from the inside. I quickly finished filling the DEF tank and hurried back to my truck. But what I found there made my hands shake as I reached for the door handle. The aluminum fuel tank was developing the same dark spots, and where I'd spilled a few drops of diesel during my last fill-up, the pavement was showing those same perfectly round holes. Whatever was in that fog, whatever was in the air at this place, it was consuming metal at an alarming rate. The attendant appeared beside me so quietly I nearly jumped out of my skin. His smile was wider now, and in the pulsing neon light from the station signs I could see that his teeth had the same metallic sheen as the fog that swirled around us. "Problem with your rig, driver?" he asked, and now his voice carried harmonics that no human throat should be able to produce, overtones that seemed to resonate in my bones and make my fillings ache. "What is this place?" I managed to ask, backing toward my cab door. "What's in that fog?" His laugh was like wind chimes made of razor blades. "Just a service station, friend. We provide what travelers need. Some need fuel, some need rest, some need other things." He gestured toward the fog, and where his fingers pointed, it swirled and eddied as if responding to his will. I could see now that what I'd taken for stains on the concrete were actually the dissolved remains of other vehicles, the outlines of cars and trucks that had stopped here and never left. The metal had been completely consumed, leaving behind only shadowy impressions and the organic materials that the fog couldn't touch: fabric, rubber, plastic, and things I didn't want to think about too carefully. My truck was dying around me. The exhaust stacks had holes the size of quarters now, and I could see the engine beginning to show the same dark spotting. Whatever gas was eating away at the metal, it was working faster now, as if my fear was somehow feeding it, making it stronger and more aggressive. I threw myself into the cab and turned the key, praying the engine would still respond. The Caterpillar diesel coughed and wheezed, but it caught, and I could feel the familiar vibration of combustion running through the chassis. The holes in the exhaust system made the engine sound like a wounded animal, but it was still producing power, still capable of getting me away from this nightmare place. As I pulled away from the pumps, I looked in my mirrors and saw the attendant standing motionless in the fog, that impossible smile still fixed on his face. But now I could see others emerging from the mist, figures that might once have been human but were now something else, something that belonged to the fog and the corrosive gas that traveled with it. The highway ahead was still shrouded in that yellow mist, but I drove toward it anyway, because staying meant becoming another shadow on the concrete, another outline dissolved by whatever unholy chemistry ruled this place. My exhaust stacks rattled and wheezed, more metal disappearing every mile, but the engine kept running, kept pulling me forward through the fog. It took 3 hours to reach clear air, 3 hours of watching my truck slowly dissolve around me, while that metallic smell grew stronger and stronger. When I finally emerged into clean night air under actual stars, the relief was overwhelming. I pulled over at the first safe spot and walked around my rig, surveying the damage. The exhaust stacks were gone entirely, just ragged holes where they'd been mounted. My fuel tanks looked like Swiss cheese, held together more by hope than structural integrity. The chrome was completely gone from my bumpers, and my mirrors showed pitting and corrosion that would take weeks to properly. The Woman Who Rides the Interstate Wind, from Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that the night becomes your closest companion, and like any relationship that spans thousands of miles and countless hours, you learn to read its moods. Tonight, as my Peterbilt rumbled down Interstate 40 through the high desert of New Mexico, the night felt restless. The wind that had been gentle at sunset now pushed against my 18-wheeler with increasing insistence, creating that low whistle through the cab that every trucker knows means weather's coming. My name's Marcus, and I've been running this route from Phoenix to Oklahoma City for the better part of 15 years. I know every truck stop, every grade, every place where the wind likes to play tricks on an unsuspecting driver. But tonight felt different, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the warmth radiating from the engine. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter, drivers warning each other about speed traps and weather conditions ahead. Got some serious wind building up near mile marker 217. Came a gravelly voice I recognized as old Pete. a veteran driver who'd been running these roads since before I got my CDL. "Y'all be careful out there. Wind's doing some strange things tonight." I clicked my mic twice to acknowledge and checked my mirrors. Behind me stretched an endless ribbon of asphalt, lit only by the red glow of my taillights. Ahead, my headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, revealing scrub brush bent sideways by the wind and tumbleweeds dancing across the pavement like ghostly performers. Mile marker 217 came and went, and old Pete hadn't been exaggerating. The wind hit my trailer like a massive invisible hand, pushing the whole rig sideways enough that I had to grip the steering wheel tighter and ease off the throttle. My load was paper products bound for Tulsa. Not particularly heavy, but with enough surface area on that trailer to catch every gust like a sail. That's when I first heard it, or thought I heard it. Between the wind and the steady rumble of the diesel engine, there came something else. A sound that seemed to weave itself around the more familiar noises of the highway. It was almost musical, like someone humming a melody just at the edge of hearing. I turned down the radio and listened more carefully, but the sound faded, replaced by the ordinary symphony of tires on asphalt and air rushing past the cab. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. when I crested a long hill and saw the lights of a truck stop ahead. The wind had been getting progressively stronger, and I was starting to think about pulling over to wait it out when I spotted something in my peripheral vision that made me ease off the accelerator. There, running alongside my truck in the median strip, was a figure, a woman, her long hair streaming behind her like a banner, her white dress billowing around her as she moved. But she wasn't running, not exactly. Her feet barely seemed to touch the ground, and she was keeping pace with my truck effortlessly, even though I was still doing close to 60 miles per hour. I blinked hard, certain that fatigue was playing tricks on my eyes, but when I looked again, she was still there. Her face was turned toward my cab, and even though the distance and darkness should have made it impossible, I could see her features clearly. She was beautiful in an ethereal way, with pale skin that seemed to glow with its own light and dark eyes that held mine with an intensity that made my hands tremble on the steering wheel. The CB radio erupted with static, and through the white noise came that humming again, clearer now, a haunting melody that seemed to reach directly into my chest and wrap itself around my heart. The woman's lips were moving, and I realized she was the source of the sound, though how her voice was coming through my radio was beyond my understanding. "Breaker 19, anyone else seeing this?" I managed to key the mic with a shaking hand. "Got a situation out here near mile marker 220. Nothing but static answered me. Even the background chatter that had been constant all night had fallen silent, as if every other driver on the highway had simply vanished. The woman was closer now, impossibly close, running in the narrow space between the median and my trailer. Her dress whipped around her in the wind, and I could see that it wasn't really white, but rather the pale color of moonlight on fog. Her feet, when they touched the ground at all, were bare, and she left no tracks in the sandy soil of the median. I pressed harder on the accelerator, some primal part of my brain screaming that I needed to get away from whatever was pacing my truck. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 75, but she stayed right with me, her impossible gait never changing, her dark eyes never leaving mine. The humming grew louder, filling the cab now, and with it came words, though they seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to my mind. "So lonely," the voice whispered, sweet and sad and infinitely patient. "So many years of running alone. Come with me, Marcus. Come and rest." She knew my name. Somehow, this impossible woman running alongside my truck in the desert wind knew my name, and the way she said it made something deep in my chest ache with a loneliness I'd been carrying for years, without fully acknowledging. The truck stop was getting closer, its neon signs creating pools of colored light in the darkness ahead. Other trucks were parked there, their running lights like distant stars, and I focused on them as anchors to reality. Real trucks, real drivers, real world, not this dream thing running beside me in the wind. But as I drew nearer to the exit ramp, the woman suddenly changed direction, no longer running parallel to my truck, but angling toward it. She reached out one pale hand, and even though she was still 15 feet away, I could swear I felt her fingers brush against my cheek through the closed window of the cab. The sensation sent ice through my veins, and I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, taking the exit faster than was safe with a full load. The trailer swayed dangerously behind me, and for a moment I thought I was going to jackknife right there on the off-ramp. But the truck straightened out, and I managed to bring it to a shuddering stop in the diesel lane of the truck stop. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. The sudden silence after hours of road noise felt oppressive, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and my own ragged breathing. I looked around frantically for any sign of the woman, but the parking lot was empty except for the scattered trucks of other drivers getting their mandatory rest. I sat there for several minutes, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was some kind of hallucination, brought on by too much coffee and not enough sleep. But when I finally worked up the courage to check my mirrors, I could see her standing at the edge of the truck stop's light, just beyond the reach of the neon glow. She was perfectly still now, no longer carried by impossible wind, but she was watching me, waiting. Her dress moved gently around her as if stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel, and that haunting melody drifted across the parking lot, barely audible but unmistakably there. I fumbled for my logbook, desperate to focus on something mundane and real. Required rest period, fuel levels, delivery schedule, normal things that belong to the world of asphalt and diesel fuel and bills of lading. But even as I rode, I could feel her presence at the edge of my awareness, patient and persistent. Other drivers came and went, fueling up, grabbing coffee and snacks from the convenience store, going through the ordinary rituals of life on the road. None of them seemed to notice the woman standing motionless beyond the lights. When I tried to point her out to a driver at the next pump, he looked where I was pointing and shrugged. "Don't see nothing but empty desert, partner. You okay? You look like you seen a ghost." Maybe I had. The thought should have been comforting, explaining away the impossible thing I'd witnessed, but it only made the ache in my chest deeper, because part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, had been tempted by her invitation.
Come and rest.
How long had it been since I'd truly rested? How many years since I'd felt anything but the constant motion of wheels on pavement? I forced myself to complete my required break, checking and rechecking my load securement, inspecting tires I'd already inspected twice, anything to avoid looking toward the edge of the lot where she waited. But when it came time to fire up the engine and merge back onto the interstate, I couldn't help but glance in that direction one more time. She was gone. The spot where she'd been standing was empty, showing nothing but scrub grass bent low by the wind,